The attack on Calth represented one of the most meticulously planned acts of treachery in the entire Horus Heresy. While the War Master's forces advanced toward Terra, the Word-Bearer's Legion, under the command of Primarch Lorgar Aurelian and his first captain Corferon, orchestrated a strike designed to eliminate the Ultramarines as a strategic threat. The world of Calth, a thriving manufacturing hub within the realm of Ultramar, became the stage for this betrayal, a carefully selected target that would draw in substantial Ultramarines forces under the pretense of a joint military operation against the Orc Empire of Gaslack. Corferon's tactical deployment demonstrated the Word-Bearer's capacity for strategic deception. The Legion arrived at Calth with approximately 50,000 Astartes, a force that appeared consistent with the planned joint operation. Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, had positioned significant elements of his legion at Calth in preparation for the campaign, including substantial fleet assets and ground forces. The Word-Bearer's vessels took up positions that seemed appropriate for allies preparing for a combined operation, their weapon systems oriented away from the Ultramarines' fleet in a display of trust. This positioning was, in fact, a calculated arrangement that placed Word-Bearer's warships at optimal firing solutions for a devastating first strike. The opening moments of the betrayal unfolded with brutal efficiency. Word-Bearer's vessels throughout the Calth system simultaneously opened fire on their unsuspecting targets. The Ultramarines' fleet, caught completely unprepared for an attack from supposed allies, suffered catastrophic losses in the initial salvos. Void shields remained lowered, weapons were powered down for maintenance, and crew members were at standard operational stations rather than battle positions. The Word-Bearers exploited every advantage their treachery provided. Macro cannons tore through unshielded hulls, lance strikes vaporized entire sections of Ultramarines' vessels, and torpedo spreads overwhelmed point defense systems that had been operating at minimal readiness. The orbital strike extended beyond simple ship-to-ship combat. Corferon had positioned his forces to simultaneously assault Calth's surface infrastructure. The Word-Bearers targeted the planet's orbital defense platforms, shipyards, and communication arrays with coordinated precision. The Viridian Star, Calth's sun, became a weapon in itself when Word-Bearer's vessels disabled the orbital stations responsible for managing the massive plasma vents that regulated the star's radiation output. The resulting stellar flare would eventually strip away much of Calth's atmosphere and render the surface uninhabitable, though this process would unfold over the course of the battle rather than instantaneously. Ground forces faced equally devastating surprise attacks. Word-Bearer's units that had been stationed at various locations across Calth as part of the joint operation preparations turned on their Ultramarines counterparts without warning. Barracks, armories, and command centers became killing grounds as the 17th Legion opened fire on legionaries who had, moments before, considered them brothers. The Word-Bearers had mapped every significant Ultramarines position on Calth, identifying key targets and optimal strike vectors weeks in advance. Supply depots exploded as demolition charges planted during friendly visits detonated. Communication hubs went dark as Word-Bearers' units seized control or destroyed them entirely. The theological dimensions of this betrayal ran deeper than simple military pragmatism. Lorgar's vendetta against Roboute Guilliman stemmed from events decades earlier, when the Emperor had ordered the Ultramarines to destroy the city of Monarchia on the world of Khur. The Word-Bearers had transformed Monarchia into a monument to the Emperor's divinity, a perfect city dedicated to the worship of the Master of Mankind. The Emperor's response had been absolute rejection. He had forced the entire Word-Bearers' legion to kneel in the ashes of Monarchia, while he publicly rebuked Lorgar for spreading religious faith across the Imperium. The Emperor had explicitly forbidden worship, insisting he was not a god, and condemned the Word-Bearers' slow rate of compliance compared to other legions. Guilliman had served as the instrument of that humiliation, leading the Ultramarines in the destruction of Monarchia. To Lorgar, this made the Lord of Ultramar the embodiment of everything the Emperor represented: cold rationality, rejection of faith, and the denial of fundamental truths that Lorgar believed were self-evident. The word-bearer's Primarch had spent the intervening decades nursing this grievance, while simultaneously discovering what he considered the actual gods worthy of worship, the ruinous powers of chaos. The betrayal at Calth thus represented both personal revenge and ideological warfare. Lorgar sought to punish Guilliman for his role in Monarchia's destruction, while simultaneously proving the superiority of faith over reason by defeating the most organized and theoretically minded of all the legions. The strategic calculus behind the Calth operation extended far beyond personal vendettas. The Ultramarines represented the single largest loyalist legion, with estimates placing their numbers at approximately 250,000 Astartes before the heresy began. This numerical superiority, combined with Guilliman's tactical acumen and the extensive infrastructure of Ultramar, made the 13th Legion the greatest potential threat to Horus's advance on Terra. If the Ultramarines could be pinned down far from the throne world, forced to fight for their own territory rather than reinforcing Terra's defenses, the Warmaster's chances of victory increased substantially. Cor Pharon's attack succeeded in this strategic objective. The Ultramarines' forces at Calth found themselves fighting for survival rather than preparing to intervene in the wider war. Tens of thousands of Ultramarines were committed to the battle, along with substantial fleet assets and materiel that could have been deployed to Terra. The word-bearers had effectively removed a significant portion of the most powerful Loyalist Legion from the crucial opening stages of the Civil War. Even if the Ultramarines eventually prevailed at Calth, the time lost and resources expended would delay any potential relief force by months or years. The manifestation of demonic entities on Calth's surface marked a turning point in the character of the heresy. The Gal Vorbak, word-bearers who had undergone possession by warp entities in the depths of the Eye of Terror, appeared on the battlefield as living proof of chaos corruption. These possessed Astartes' demonstrated abilities that defied conventional understanding, unnatural strength, regeneration from wounds that should have been fatal, and an aura of terror that affected even other space marines. Their armor had fused with their flesh, and their bodies had been reshaped by demonic influence into forms that blended Astartes' physiology with warp-born mutations. Beyond the Gal Vorbak, other demonic manifestations began appearing as the battle progressed. Word-bearers' sorcerers conducted rituals across Calth's surface, using the death and destruction as fuel for summoning entities from the warp. Bloodletters materialized in the midst of Ultramarines' formations, their hellblades cutting through ceramite with supernatural ease. Plaguebearers shambled through underground arcologies, spreading contagion and despair. These manifestations represented one of the first major incursions of demonic forces into Ultramar, a realm that had previously been characterized by order, reason, and imperial truth doctrine. The Ultramarines' response to these warps spawned horrors revealed the limitations of their training and doctrine. The 13th Legion had been raised on principles of logic, tactical flexibility, and adherence to the imperial truth's materialist philosophy. Demons were not supposed to exist according to that worldview. The appearance of entities that violated physical laws, that reformed after being destroyed, and that could corrupt reality itself through their mere presence, challenged everything the Ultramarines had been taught. Individual squads and companies developed ad hoc responses to these threats, discovering through bitter experience that some weapons and tactics proved more effective against warp entities than others, but the Legion as a whole lacked any doctrinal framework for combating demonic incursion. The underground arcologies of Calth became particularly nightmarish battlegrounds. These vast subterranean cities, designed to shelter populations during solar flares and provide manufacturing facilities protected from surface conditions, transformed into labyrinthine war zones where Ultramarines and Word-Bearers' forces clashed in brutal close-quarters combat. The confined spaces negated many advantages of coordinated maneuver warfare, reducing battles to desperate fights in corridors and chambers, where both sides struggled for control of critical infrastructure. Word-Bearers units deliberately drove civilians into kill zones, using the mass panic and death to fuel further demonic manifestations. The Ultramarines found themselves fighting not just to defeat an enemy force, but to protect millions of civilian refugees, while simultaneously containing warp incursions that threatened to tear reality apart. The partnership between Lorgar Aurelian and Angron crystallized in the aftermath of Calth's initial devastation, though its foundations had been laid years earlier during the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. Lorgar had witnessed his brother's suffering firsthand. The butcher's nails implanted in Angron's skull were slowly killing him, transforming the Primarch into something that could barely be called rational. Where other brothers might have seen only a broken weapon or a tragic figure beyond redemption, Lorgar recognized opportunity. The Urizen understood that Angron's rage and pain made him the perfect instrument for Khorne's purposes, and by extension, for the broader goals of chaos, undivided that the Word-Bearers served. Lorgar's manipulation of Angron operated on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, he presented himself as the only brother who truly understood Angron's suffering, the only Primarch who did not judge the 12th Legion's Primarch for his inability to control the aggression that the Nails forced upon him. The Word-Bearer's Primarch spoke to Angron of liberation rather than damnation, framing service to the Blood God not as corruption, but as the fulfillment of what Angron had always been. The Nails had made Angron a creature of violence and rage. Khorne would make that existence meaningful, transforming pointless suffering into divine purpose. This theological framework provided Angron with something he had never possessed, a justification for the monster the Emperor's neglect had allowed him to become. The deeper layer of Lorgar's manipulation involved his knowledge of Angron's deteriorating physical condition. The butcher's nails were killing the Red Angel, and Lorgar knew it. The implants were never designed for a Primarch's physiology, and they were slowly destroying Angron's brain, causing him constant agony while simultaneously robbing him of any capacity for peace or contemplation. Lorgar had consulted with the most learned Dark Apostles and sorcerers of his legion, and they had confirmed what he suspected. Angron had perhaps decades left before the Nails killed him entirely, but demonic ascension offered an alternative. By becoming a demon prince of Khorne, Angron would transcend his failing flesh entirely, achieving immortality and power beyond even a Primarch's considerable abilities. Lorgar positioned himself as the guide who would lead Angron to this transformation, though he carefully avoided revealing the full cost of such ascension until the moment of transformation itself. The philosophical gulf between the Word-Bearers and World Eaters ran deeper than simple tactical preferences or organizational culture. The 17th Legion approached chaos worship with the same methodical devotion they had once directed toward the Emperor. Their faith was structured, hierarchical, and purposeful. Dark Apostles led congregations of warriors in rituals that had been carefully researched and codified. The Word-Bearers studied the nature of the warp with scholarly intensity, cataloging demon types, researching summoning methodologies, and developing theological frameworks that explained the relationship between the chaos gods and the material universe. Even their violence served calculated purposes. Sacrifices were conducted according to specific ritual parameters, and battles were planned to generate particular types of warp resonance that would facilitate desired outcomes. The World Eaters represented the antithesis of this approach. The 12th Legion had devolved into a force that existed purely for slaughter. The Butcher's nails, which had spread from Angron to his sons as they sought to better understand their gene father, had transformed the Legion into a collection of barely controlled berserkers. Where the Word-Bearers saw war as a means to achieve spiritual and strategic objectives, the World Eaters experienced combat as the only state in which the nails allowed them any relief from constant pain. The implants punished inactivity with agony and rewarded violence with something approaching pleasure, or at least, the absence of torment. This created a feedback loop where World Eaters sought battle not for any strategic purpose, but simply to escape the suffering that defined their existence between engagements. The Nails had stripped away much of what made the World Eaters effective combined arms warriors. Tactical planning became nearly impossible when officers could barely restrain themselves from charging the enemy immediately. Fire support and coordinated maneuvers gave way to frenzied assaults where individual World Eaters simply ran toward the nearest enemy, hacking and killing until nothing remained alive in their vicinity. The Legion had once possessed its own character and culture, traditions that stretched back to the Warhound's era before Angron's discovery, but the spread of the Nails had eroded these elements until little remained except the compulsion to kill. Apothecaries who had once maintained the Legion's gene seed and tended to wounded brothers became little more than Nails installation technicians. Tech Marines focused their efforts on maintaining chain axes rather than the full spectrum of Legion equipment. Erebus and Karn emerged as the practical coordinators of the Shadow Crusade despite neither holding supreme command of their respective legions. Erebus served as Lorgar's first chaplain and had been instrumental in the Word-Bearer's fall to chaos, having murdered the previous first chaplain and manipulated events to steer the Legion toward the ruinous powers. His position gave him authority over the spiritual direction of the 17th Legion, and Lorgar trusted him to implement the Crusade's strategic objectives. Karn held the position of captain of the 8th Assault Company within the World Eaters, but his reputation as one of the most effective warriors in the Legion and his close relationship with Angron gave him influence far beyond his official rank. The relationship between these two warriors combined necessity with profound mutual distrust. Erebus recognized that the World Eaters required management. Left to their own devices, they would simply charge from one battle to the next without strategic coherence, wasting their strength on targets of no importance while ignoring objectives that actually mattered to the Crusade's goals. Karn possessed enough residual tactical acumen and force of personality to impose some degree of organization on World Eaters' forces, making him invaluable as a liaison. The first chaplain cultivated this relationship carefully, providing Karn with intelligence about target worlds, suggesting approach vectors and deployment strategies, and ensuring that World Eaters' assaults complemented Word-Bearer's operations rather than interfering with them. Karn's perspective on this partnership reflected his growing disillusionment with what his Legion had become. He retained enough clarity, perhaps due to some quirk in his physiology or the specific configuration of his nails, to recognize that the World Eaters were devolving into something less than Astartes. He watched brothers who had once been capable warriors and even friends transform into creatures that could barely communicate beyond roars of rage. The Legion's command structure had collapsed into a system where whoever killed most effectively gained followers, and strategic planning had been replaced by simply pointing the Legion at a target and watching them tear it apart. Karn saw in Erebus someone who still fought with purpose rather than simply to satisfy the Nail's demands, and this purposefulness attracted him even as he recognized the Word-Bearer's manipulative nature. Erebus exploited Karn's disillusionment methodically. The first chaplain positioned himself as a voice of reason, someone who understood that war required more than mindless slaughter. He shared intelligence with Karn that allowed the World Eaters captain to achieve tactical successes, reinforcing the perception that cooperation with the Word-Bearers led to more satisfying battles. Erebus also carefully fed Karn's resentment toward those within the World Eaters who had fully embraced the Nail's influence, subtly encouraging the captain to see himself as one of the last true warriors in a legion of rabid dogs. This manipulation served multiple purposes. It kept Karn cooperative, it gave Erebus a tool for directing World Eaters' forces, and it created a dependable relationship that could be exploited for future objectives. The strategic complementarity between the two legions manifested most clearly in their approach to planetary assault operations. Word-Bearer's forces would typically make initial planetfall with the goal of establishing ritual sites and identifying key infrastructure targets. Dark Apostles and their congregations would begin summoning rituals, while tactical squads secured perimeters and eliminated organized resistance. The 17th Legion excelled at this phase of operations. Their discipline and organization allowed them to establish secure positions quickly, and their sorceress capabilities gave them tools for reconnaissance and area denial that conventional forces could not match. Possessed Marines and summoned demons could be deployed to specific locations where their abilities would prove most effective, and Word-Bearer's officers retained enough tactical flexibility to adapt to changing battlefield conditions. Once the Word-Bearers had prepared the battlefield, World Eaters forces would deploy for the primary assault. The 12th Legion's berserkers would crash into enemy defensive lines with overwhelming ferocity, their complete disregard for casualties and inability to experience normal fear making them devastating shock troops. World Eaters' assaults broke enemy morale through sheer horror, watching wave after wave of blood maddened Astartes charge through fire that should have stopped any attack, seeing wounded World Eaters continue fighting with injuries that should have been immediately fatal, and hearing the inhuman roars of warriors completely lost to the nail's influence. Defensive positions that might have held against conventional assaults simply collapsed under this pressure. The word-bearers would exploit the chaos created by World Eaters' attacks to achieve specific objectives. While enemy forces focused on the immediate threat of berserkers tearing through their lines, word-bearers' units would seize command centers, secure vital infrastructure, or complete ritual preparations that required specific conditions. Sorcerers could work their arts more effectively when enemy psychers and commanders were distracted or dead, and the emotional resonance of mass slaughter provided potent fuel for warp-based abilities. The combination proved devastatingly effective. The World Eaters destroyed the enemy's ability to resist, while the word-bearers ensured that each victory served the larger strategic and spiritual objectives of the Crusade. Demonic summoning represented perhaps the most significant force multiplier the word-bearers brought to the partnership. Dark Apostles had spent years studying the methodologies of calling forth warp entities and binding them to service. The presence of the World Eaters enhanced these efforts considerably. The sheer volume of violence and bloodshed that followed the 12th Legion created ideal conditions for manifesting demons of Khorne. Bloodletters and Fleshhounds could be summoned directly into the midst of ongoing World Eaters assaults, adding warp-born strength to already overwhelming attacks. The demons' immunity to morale effects and their supernatural resilience complemented the World Eaters' fearlessness and pain tolerance, creating combined forces that could overwhelm almost any defensive position. The Ruin Storm emerged from the convergence of atrocities committed across dozens of worlds simultaneously, a testament to the word-bearers' capacity for coordinated malevolence on a galactic scale. While the Shadow Crusade appeared to outside observers as a campaign of conquest and destruction, its true purpose involved creating the precise conditions necessary for a warp phenomenon of unprecedented magnitude. Each world targeted by the combined word-bearers and World Eaters forces had been selected through years of careful analysis, chosen not merely for strategic value, but for specific qualities that would make their destruction particularly resonant in the Immaterium. Lorgar had tasked his most learned sorcerers and Dark Apostles with identifying planets where the veil between real space and the warp was naturally thin, where populations possessed latent psychic potential, or where historical events had left psychic scars that could be exploited. The Trisagion served as the word-bearer's primary instrument for conducting the rituals that would birth the Ruin Storm. This vessel, heavily modified to serve as both warship and mobile temple, carried the most powerful Dark Apostles and sorcerers of the 17th Legion. Its holds had been converted into ritual chambers where captives could be processed through elaborate ceremonies designed to extract maximum psychic resonance from their deaths. The ship's hull bore inscriptions in languages that predated human civilization, words of power that the word-bearers had discovered during their pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. These inscriptions served to focus warp energy, transforming the Trisagion into something between a conventional vessel and a demon engine, a ship that existed partially in both real space and the Immaterium simultaneously. Erebus commanded the Trisagion during the critical phases of the Shadow Crusade, directing the vessel to worlds where specific rituals needed to be performed. The first chaplain had spent decades studying the nature of the warp, consulting with entities whose existence defied human comprehension, and he understood better than perhaps any other word-bearer, except Lorgar himself, how to manipulate the currents of the Immaterium. Each ritual conducted aboard the Trisagion followed precise parameters, specific numbers of sacrifices, particular methods of execution, and carefully timed invocations that aligned with astrological phenomena and warp tide fluctuations. The Dark Apostles who served under Erebus had been trained in these methodologies, each one capable of conducting ceremonies that would create localized warp disturbances. When these individual rituals occurred simultaneously across multiple star systems, their effects would compound and interact, creating something far greater than the sum of its parts. The selection of target worlds demonstrated the word-bearer's understanding of symbolic resonance and its importance in warp-based workings. Armatura, a major world within Ultramar's borders, possessed particular significance due to its role as a training ground for Ultramarines recruitment. The population maintained strong cultural ties to the 13th Legion, and the world's infrastructure directly supported Guilliman's military machine. When the word-bearers and World Eaters attacked Armatura, they did not simply destroy military targets, they systematically desecrated everything that represented the Ultramarines' ideals. Training facilities were transformed into charnel houses, where aspirants were butchered in mockery of the trials they had hoped to pass. Monuments to Guilliman's victories were toppled and rebuilt as shrines to the ruinous powers. The population's faith in the Imperium and their pride in their connection to the Ultramarines made their suffering particularly potent fuel for the rituals that Dark Apostles conducted across the planet's surface. Nuceria held even greater symbolic weight, though for different reasons. This was Angron's homeworld, the planet where he had been enslaved and forced to fight as a gladiator, where his fellow slaves had died while he was taken away to serve the Emperor. The Red Angel had never forgiven the Emperor for refusing to save his brothers and sisters in chains, and his hatred for Nuceria's ruling class had festered for over a century. Lorgar recognized that Angron's connection to this world made it the perfect location for the ritual that would elevate his brother to demonhood. The emotional resonance of Angron's rage, combined with the deaths of millions on the world that had tortured him, would create ideal conditions for the transformation. The word-bearers prepared Nuceria meticulously, establishing ritual sites at locations that held significance in Angron's past: the city where he had been enslaved, the mountains where he had led his rebellion, the field where his fellow gladiators had died while he was taken to the stars. Lesser worlds throughout Ultramar and surrounding sectors faced similar fates, each contributing its own note to the symphony of horror that the word-bearers orchestrated. Planets with large populations provided sheer numbers of deaths to fuel the rituals. Worlds with concentrations of psychers offered particularly potent sacrifices, their connection to the warp making their deaths create stronger ripples in the immaterium. Ancient worlds where humanity had lived for millennia possessed accumulated psychic resonance from countless generations, and their destruction sent shockwaves through the warp that propagated far beyond the systems where they occurred. The word-bearers calculated the timing of each attack with astronomical precision, ensuring that the rituals would reach their crescendo simultaneously across dozens of light years. The manifestation of the ruin storm began as localized warp disturbances around each target world. Navigators reported increasing difficulty maintaining stable warp routes in affected sectors, describing the immaterium as turbulent and filled with hostile currents that defied normal patterns. Astropaths attempting to send messages through these regions experienced visions of overwhelming horror, screaming faces, oceans of blood, and entities of pure malevolence that seemed to be coalescing from the psychic energy released by the Shadow Crusade's atrocities. Some astropaths died in the attempt to pierce the growing disturbance, their minds burned out by contact with forces they were never meant to perceive. Others survived but were left permanently damaged, haunted by what they had witnessed in the warp's depths. As the rituals reached their culmination, these individual disturbances began to merge and expand. The warp around Ultramar became increasingly unstable, with areas of complete impassability spreading like a contagion through the immaterium. Ships attempting to enter the warp in affected regions simply disappeared, their fates unknown but presumed catastrophic. Vessels already in transit, when the ruin storm manifested, found themselves caught in warp currents that bore no resemblance to any natural phenomenon. Some ships emerged in real space thousands of light years from their intended destinations, their navigators driven mad by what they had experienced. Others were never seen again, presumably lost to the entities that now inhabited the Ruinstorm's depths, or trapped in warp eddies, where time itself had ceased to flow in any comprehensible manner. The strategic impact of this isolation exceeded even Lorgar's most optimistic projections. Ultramar found itself completely cut off from the rest of the Imperium, unable to send or receive communications through conventional astropathic means, and unable to dispatch or receive reinforcements via warp travel. Guilliman's realm, which had been the most organized and militarily powerful region of Imperial space outside Terra itself, became a prison for the forces trapped within it. The Ultramarines could not march to Terra's defense, could not coordinate with other Loyalist legions, and could not even confirm whether the throne world still stood or had already fallen to Horus's forces. The uncertainty itself served as a weapon. Guilliman had to assume that Terra needed immediate reinforcement, but he could not abandon Ultramar while it was under direct assault, and he possessed no means of breaking through the Ruinstorm to reach the throne world, even if he had been willing to leave his realm undefended. The isolation extended far beyond Ultramar itself. The Ruinstorm's boundaries encompassed vast stretches of the galactic east, affecting multiple sectors and subsectors. Loyalist forces throughout this region found themselves cut off from Terra and from each other, unable to coordinate responses to traitor attacks or to consolidate their strength for counteroffensives. Individual worlds and systems became islands in a sea of warp turbulence, each forced to face whatever threats emerged from the storm without support or even knowledge of what was happening elsewhere. This fragmentation of Loyalist forces served Horus's broader strategy perfectly. The War Master needed time to reach Terra and break through its defenses, and every Loyalist legion or fleet that was pinned down far from the throne world increased his chances of success. The nature of the Ruinstorm itself defied conventional understanding of warp phenomena. Unlike typical warp storms, which were essentially areas of increased turbulence in the immaterium that made navigation difficult but not impossible, the Ruinstorm possessed a quality of malevolent intelligence. Ships attempting to traverse affected regions reported that the warp seemed actively hostile, with demon entities hunting vessels and attempting to breach Geller fields. The immaterium's normal relationship to time and space had broken down completely in the storm's heart. Ships might experience subjective journeys of days or weeks, while centuries passed in real space, or vice versa. Some vessels reported encountering impossible phenomena, fleets of ghost ships crewed by the dead, worlds that existed only in the warp, and entities so vast that they dwarfed entire star systems. The Ruinstorm's permanence distinguished it from temporary warp disturbances that might dissipate after days or weeks. Lorgar had designed the rituals that birthed the storm to create a self-sustaining phenomenon, one that would continue to draw power from the emotional resonance of the atrocities committed during the Shadow Crusade. The deaths of billions had created psychic scars in the warp that would take centuries to fade, and the storm fed on these scars, using their energy to maintain and even expand its boundaries. Dark apostles stationed throughout the affected region conducted ongoing rituals to reinforce the storm, ensuring that it would not collapse prematurely. The word-bearers had effectively weaponized the immaterium itself, transforming the warp from a medium for travel and communication into an impassable barrier that divided the Imperium against itself. Angron's transformation into a demon prince of Khorne represented both the culmination of Lorgar's manipulation of his brother and a necessary component of the Ruinstorm's creation. The Ascension ritual required a sacrifice of such magnitude that it would send shockwaves through the warp powerful enough to stabilize the storm's structure. A Primarch's apotheosis involved the death and rebirth of one of the Emperor's own sons, a being whose existence was tied to both the materium and immaterium in ways that even the most learned sorcerers only partially understood. Lorgar had calculated that Angron's transformation, conducted at the precise moment when the other rituals reached their crescendo, would provide the final surge of warp energy needed to make the Ruinstorm permanent. The preparations for Angron's ascension on Nuceria involved orchestrating slaughter on a scale that dwarfed even the other atrocities of the Shadow Crusade. The World Eaters descended upon their Primarch's homeworld with unbridled fury, killing everything they encountered with a thoroughness that left entire cities empty of life. The gladiator pits where Angron had fought were filled with corpses, blood running in rivers through the sand where he had once spilled his own blood for the entertainment of masters he despised. The mountains where his rebellion had ended became charnel grounds where millions died to fuel the ritual that would transform him. Dark Apostles channeled this death energy through carefully prepared ritual circles, focusing it toward the location where Angron himself fought at the heart of the slaughter. The Red Angel's physical form was failing rapidly by this point, the Butcher's nails having degraded his brain to the point where death was imminent. Lorgar presented the Ascension as salvation, the only path that would allow Angron to continue existing and fighting rather than dying alone and forgotten on a world he hated. The Word-Bearer's Primarch did not reveal the full cost of demonhood, that Angron would become a slave to Khorne, bound to the Blood God's will and unable to exist in real space except under specific conditions. Lorgar framed the transformation as liberation, as the ultimate fulfillment of what the Nails had made Angron into, and the dying Primarch accepted because the alternative was simply ceasing to exist. The systematic dismantling of Ultramar's 500 worlds required a level of strategic coordination that few military campaigns in Imperial history could match. The Word-Bearers approached this task with the methodical precision that had once characterized their compliance campaigns during the Great Crusade, but now twisted toward purposes of corruption and desecration. Lorgar and his subordinates had spent years analyzing the structure of Guilliman's realm, identifying not just military targets, but the fundamental pillars that supported Ultramar's civilization. They understood that destroying Ultramar meant more than simply killing its defenders. It required breaking the systems of governance, supply, and communication that made the 500 worlds function as a unified whole rather than a collection of isolated planets. Armatura stood among the most critical targets in this campaign, serving as a primary recruitment and training world for the Ultramarines Legion. The planet maintained extensive facilities dedicated to identifying, testing, and preparing aspirants for the transformation into Astartes. These facilities represented decades of investment and refinement, embodying Guilliman's systematic approach to Legion recruitment. The world's population took immense pride in their role supporting the 13th Legion, with entire generations of families serving in various capacities within the training complexes. This cultural connection to the Ultramarines made Armatura's corruption particularly devastating from both practical and psychological perspectives. The Word-Bearers struck Armatura with overwhelming force, achieving orbital supremacy within hours of entering the system. Their fleet had been reinforced specifically for this operation, including battle barges and strike cruisers that had been modified with warp-corrupted technologies. These vessels carried teleportarium, arrays far more sophisticated than standard Imperial designs, allowing the Word-Bearers to deploy entire companies directly into key locations on the planet's surface. Dark Apostles materialized inside Armatura's orbital defense command centers, their possessed bodyguards cutting down defenders before warning could be sent. Other teleportation strikes targeted the planet's astropathic choir facilities, silencing the Psykers before they could transmit distress calls that might bring Ultramarines reinforcements. The initial assault phase focused on securing strategic locations rather than immediately massacring the population. Word-Bearers' tactical squads seized control of Armatura's primary spaceports, preventing evacuation and ensuring that subsequent waves of traitor forces could land without opposition. Armored columns moved to surround the major training facilities, establishing perimeters that would contain any Ultramarines forces present on the planet. The 17th Legion demonstrated their capacity for conventional warfare during this phase, executing combined arms operations with the same efficiency they had displayed before their fall to chaos. Predator tanks provided fire support for advancing infantry, land raiders deployed tactical squads into optimal positions, and whirlwind batteries suppressed any organized resistance before it could coalesce into effective counterattacks. Once the Word-Bearers had established control over Armatura's infrastructure, the true nature of their assault became apparent. Dark Apostles began identifying individuals within the population who possessed latent psychic potential or who held positions of influence within local power structures. These individuals were not killed immediately, but instead subjected to intensive indoctrination efforts. The Word-Bearers had refined techniques for breaking human resistance to chaos corruption, combining psychological torture with exposure to warp phenomena and forced participation in rituals that gradually eroded the victim's sense of self. Some subjects broke quickly, their minds unable to withstand the horrors inflicted upon them. Others resisted longer, but the Word-Bearers possessed patience and expertise that eventually overcame even the strongest wills. The establishment of chaos cults on Armatura followed a deliberate progression designed to maximize the corruption spread through the population. Initial converts were typically individuals who had been broken through direct Word-Bearers' intervention, but these first-generation cultists then served as vectors for recruiting others. The cults offered explanations for the suffering that Armatura's population was experiencing, framing the Word-Bearers' invasion as divine judgment against the false promises of the imperial truth. They provided community and purpose to people whose entire world had been shattered by the sudden betrayal of forces they had believed were allies. The cults grew with disturbing speed, particularly among populations that had been displaced from their homes or who had witnessed atrocities that broke their faith in the Imperium's ability to protect them. The desecration of imperial monuments across Armatura served multiple purposes beyond simple symbolic destruction. The Word-Bearers identified statues, buildings, and other structures that represented Ultramar's ideals and systematically transformed them into shrines dedicated to the ruinous powers. A monument commemorating Guilliman's victories was rebuilt with its heroic figures replaced by demonic entities, the inscriptions praising the Primarch's tactical genius rewritten as hymns to the dark gods. Training facilities where aspirants had prepared for their trials became temples, where cultists conducted rituals involving the torture and sacrifice of those same aspirants. These desecrations served to demoralize any remaining loyalists while simultaneously creating locations that resonated with warp energy, making it easier for sorcerers to conduct summoning rituals and maintain demonic manifestations. The Word-Bearers' methodology of preparing worlds before the World Eaters arrived reflected their understanding of how to maximize both legions' effectiveness. The 17th Legion would spend weeks or even months on a target world, systematically breaking down organized resistance and establishing the conditions necessary for effective corruption. They neutralized planetary defense forces through a combination of direct military action and infiltration, with cultists sabotaging weapon systems, providing intelligence about defensive positions, and spreading misinformation that prevented coordinated responses to traitor movements. By the time the World Eaters made planetfall, most organized military opposition had been eliminated or rendered ineffective, leaving only scattered resistance that posed no real threat to the Berserkers' advance. The arrival of World Eaters' forces transformed these carefully prepared battlefields into abattoirs. The 12th Legion descended upon target worlds with no interest in strategic objectives or infrastructure preservation. They existed solely to kill. World Eaters' drop pods hammered into population centers, disgorging squads of Berserkers who immediately charged toward the nearest concentrations of life. The Butcher's nails drove them forward with relentless intensity, and the modifications that many World Eaters had undergone made them terrifying to behold. Ceramite armor bore layers of dried blood from previous battles, chain axes had been decorated with trophies taken from victims, and the warriors themselves roared constant challenges and threats in voices that had been rendered inhuman by the nail's influence. The tactical doctrine employed during planetary assaults demonstrated how the two legions' capabilities complemented each other despite their vastly different approaches to warfare. Word-Bearers' forces maintained orbital supremacy throughout each operation, their fleets positioned to prevent any escape from target worlds, while simultaneously providing fire support for ground operations. The 17th Legion's ships carried sophisticated augury, arrays that tracked enemy movements and identified concentrations of resistance, feeding this intelligence to both word-bearers and World Eaters commanders on the surface. Lance strikes from orbit could be called down on hardened defensive positions, softening them before World Eaters' assaults or eliminating threats that might otherwise have required extended sieges to overcome. The establishment of teleportarium beachheads became a signature element of the Shadow Crusade's tactical approach. Word-bearers' boarding parties would materialize inside enemy vessels or fortifications, seizing control of critical systems before defenders could respond effectively. These beachheads served as anchor points for subsequent waves of reinforcements, allowing traitor forces to bypass external defenses entirely and strike directly at a target's heart. The word-bearers' sorcerers enhanced these operations by conducting rituals that temporarily stabilized the warp in specific locations, making teleportation more reliable than it would normally be across such distances. Some Dark Apostles could even create temporary warp rifts that allowed demons to manifest directly inside enemy strongholds, adding warp-born horrors to the confusion created by the initial assault. World Eaters' ground assaults followed predictable patterns because the Nails left the 12th Legion's warriors with little capacity for tactical flexibility. They would identify the nearest enemy position and charge toward it along the most direct route available, hacking through any obstacles in their path. This predictability should have made World Eaters' attacks easy to counter, but the sheer ferocity of their assaults overwhelmed most defensive preparations. Defensive lines designed to stop conventional attacks simply collapsed under the pressure of warriors who felt no fear and experienced wounds as minor inconveniences rather than debilitating injuries. World Eaters would continue fighting with injuries that should have killed them immediately, the Nails flooding their systems with combat stimulants that kept them mobile and aggressive even as they bled out from catastrophic damage. The psychological impact of World Eaters' assaults proved as devastating as their physical violence. Defenders watching berserkers charge through fire that killed dozens of their brothers, seeing wounded World Eaters pull themselves forward on shattered limbs to continue attacking, and hearing the inhuman roars of warriors completely lost to the Nails' influence. These experiences broke morale in ways that conventional combat could not. Soldiers who might have held their positions against a normal assault would flee in panic when faced with World Eaters, and the resulting rout would allow the berserkers to pursue and slaughter routing forces with ease. The 12th Legion's reputation preceded them as the Shadow Crusade progressed, with populations on worlds not yet attacked hearing reports of what had happened elsewhere and experiencing terror that undermined their will to resist before the World Eaters even arrived. Nuceria represented a target of unique significance within the Shadow Crusade, though its strategic value to Ultramar's infrastructure was minimal. The world had contributed nothing of note to the Imperium since Angron's removal over a century earlier, remaining a backwater planet whose ruling class maintained power through gladiatorial traditions and slave labor. Lorgar selected Nuceria not for military reasons, but because of its connection to Angron's past and its suitability as the site for the Red Angel's apotheosis. The Word-Bearer's Primarch understood that his brother's rage toward this world ran deeper than simple hatred. Nuceria represented everything that had broken Angron, the place where he had been enslaved and forced to kill for entertainment, where his fellow gladiators had died while he was taken away to serve the Emperor who had refused to save them. The assault on Nuceria unfolded with apocalyptic intensity as the World Eaters descended upon their Primarch's homeworld without restraint. Angron himself led the attack, his presence driving his sons into frenzies of violence that exceeded even their normal levels of aggression. The Red Angel had waited decades for the opportunity to return to Nuceria and exact vengeance upon those who had enslaved him, and the Butcher's nails ensured that this vengeance would be absolute. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to ruins within hours as World Eaters tore through every structure, killing every living thing they encountered. The gladiator pits where Angron had fought were filled with the corpses of Nuceria's ruling class, forced to die in the same arenas where they had once watched slaves kill each other for entertainment. The Ultramarines' attempts to defend their realm against this coordinated assault faced nearly insurmountable challenges. Guilliman had designed Ultramar's defensive strategy around the assumption that he would be present to coordinate responses to major threats, with chapter masters commanding individual worlds and sectors, but operating within an overall framework that the Primarch himself would direct. The Shadow Crusade's timing and scope shattered this command structure. Guilliman was trapped at Calth, fighting for survival against Corpheron's forces in the underground arcologies, unable to communicate with the rest of his legion or provide strategic direction for defending the 500 worlds. The Ruinstorm's interference with astropathic communication meant that chapter masters across Ultramar were operating blind, unable to coordinate with each other or even confirm which worlds were under attack and which remained secure. Individual chapter masters found themselves forced to make decisions that would normally have required Guilliman's approval, or at least consultation with other senior commanders. Some chose to consolidate their forces, abandoning less defensible positions to establish stronger defensive lines around critical worlds. Others attempted to maintain presence across multiple systems, spreading their forces thin in an effort to protect as many Imperial citizens as possible. These decisions were made without knowledge of the broader strategic situation. A chapter master might commit his forces to defending a world that the traitors had no intention of attacking, while leaving undefended a planet that was actually a priority target. The fog of war that had descended over Ultramar meant that even tactically sound decisions could prove strategically disastrous simply because they were made without accurate intelligence about enemy movements and intentions. The Ultramarines' doctrine emphasized adaptability and the application of appropriate force to achieve objectives, but the Shadow Crusade presented challenges that defied conventional solutions. How did one defend against an enemy that could appear anywhere through teleportation? What tactical response was appropriate when facing berserkers who would not retreat regardless of casualties? How could one maintain morale among defending forces when every report from attacked worlds described atrocities that exceeded anything in the Imperium's experience? Chapter masters wrestled with these questions while simultaneously managing the practical challenges of coordinating defenses across multiple worlds, maintaining supply lines that were constantly threatened by traitor raids, and dealing with the psychological trauma that affected even Astartes, who witnessed the aftermath of World Eaters' attacks. The division of Ultramarines' forces across multiple fronts meant that the Legion could not concentrate its strength against the traitors' main thrust, because identifying where that main thrust was aimed proved impossible. Word-bearers and World Eaters' forces struck across a broad front, hitting dozens of worlds simultaneously or in rapid succession. Each attack appeared to be a major offensive, forcing Ultramarines' commanders to commit significant forces to the defense. By the time a chapter master realized that a particular attack was actually a feint or secondary operation, his forces were already engaged and could not be easily redeployed. The traitors exploited this confusion ruthlessly, using attacks on less important worlds to draw Ultramarines' forces away from targets that actually mattered to the Shadow Crusade's strategic objectives. Nuceria had remained a festering wound in Angron's psyche since the day the Emperor had taken him from its surface, leaving his fellow gladiators to die at the hands of the planetary aristocracy. The world's high rider nobility had built their civilization on the backs of slaves, forcing captives to fight in gladiatorial arenas for the entertainment of crowds that cheered as men and women killed each other in the sand. Angron had been one such slave, taken as a child and implanted with the butcher's nails, archaeotech devices that the high riders used to transform their gladiators into more aggressive fighters. The nails had robbed him of the capacity for peace, replacing any moment of calm with searing pain that could only be alleviated through violence. He had led a rebellion of his fellow slaves, a desperate uprising that had briefly threatened the high rider dominance before superior numbers and weaponry had driven the rebels into the mountains. The Emperor had arrived at the moment of the rebellion's final stand, when Angron and his brothers and sisters in chains prepared to die fighting rather than return to slavery. The Master of Mankind had offered Angron a choice that was no choice at all: come serve as a Primarch and lead a legion, or remain and die with the rebels. Angron had wanted to die with them, to share their fate as he had shared their suffering, but the Emperor had simply taken him. Teleportation had ripped the gladiator from the mountainside, leaving his companions to be slaughtered by High Rider forces while he materialized aboard an Imperial vessel. The Primarch had never forgiven this abandonment, and his hatred for Nuceria's ruling class had only intensified during the decades he had been forced to serve the Imperium. The world represented everything he despised: the casual cruelty of those who held power over the powerless, the reduction of human beings to entertainment, and the Emperor's complete disregard for the bonds Angron had formed with those who had suffered alongside him. Lorgar understood the depth of his brother's connection to Nuceria and recognized how that connection could be exploited. The Word-Bearer's Primarch had spent years studying the requirements for demonic ascension, consulting with entities in the Warp whose knowledge of such transformations exceeded anything mortal scholars could comprehend. The ritual that would elevate Angron to the status of Demon Prince required specific conditions: a site of profound personal significance to the aspirant, an offering of souls sufficient to attract the attention of the patron deity, and a moment of absolute emotional intensity that would allow the Warp to breach into realspace with enough force to remake a Primarch's fundamental nature. Nuceria satisfied all these requirements. The world's connection to Angron's past provided the symbolic resonance necessary for the ritual's framework. The population numbered in the billions, offering more than enough deaths to fuel the transformation. And Angron's rage toward this world burned with an intensity that the Word-Bearer's sorcerers could channel and amplify into the emotional catalyst the ritual demanded. The World Eaters descended upon Nuceria with their Primarch at their vanguard, and the assault began with a fury that exceeded even the 12th Legion's normal standards of violence. Angron led the initial drop pod assault personally, his landing pod slamming into the surface in the mountain region where his rebellion had ended. The Red Angel emerged already killing, his chain axes Gorchild and Gorefather tearing through High Rider security forces that had been stationed at the historical site. His sons followed in waves, each drop pod impact sending berserkers charging outward to slaughter everything in their path. The World Eaters had been told they were returning to their Gene Father's homeworld, and while most of them lacked the cognitive capacity to understand the significance, the nails drove them to kill with even greater enthusiasm than usual. This was Angron's world, and they would paint it red in his honor. The systematic genocide unfolded across every continent and major population center simultaneously. World Eaters' forces spread out from their landing zones in expanding circles of slaughter, killing every human they encountered regardless of age, gender, or any attempt at surrender. The High Rider nobility discovered that their wealth and status meant nothing to warriors who existed only to kill. Aristocrats who had spent their lives watching slaves die for their entertainment found themselves dragged into the same arenas and butchered by chain axe and bolt round. The gladiator pits that had been the foundation of Nucerian culture became mass graves as World Eaters threw corpses into the sand by the thousands. Some berserkers spent hours in the arenas, killing captives in mockery of the gladiatorial combats that had once been performed there, though their kills lacked any of the skill or technique that actual gladiators had displayed. The World Eaters simply hacked their victims apart with mechanical efficiency. Word-Bearer's forces accompanied the World Eaters throughout the assault, though their role differed fundamentally from the simple slaughter their allies pursued. Dark Apostles had identified specific locations across Nuceria that would serve as focal points for the Ascension ritual, sites where Angron had fought as a slave, where he had killed his first opponent in the arena, where he had led his fellow rebels in their doomed uprising. At each location, Word-Bearer's sorcerers established ritual circles using materials that had been prepared aboard the Trisagion during the voyage to Nuceria. These circles incorporated components that resonated with Khorne's nature: brass taken from demon engines, weapons that had been used to kill thousands, and fragments of armor worn by warriors who had died in particularly violent battles. The sorcerers inscribed the circles with words of power in languages that predated human civilization, each syllable carefully pronounced to create the proper resonance in the warp. The Gal Vorbak played a crucial role in maintaining these ritual sites against any potential interference. These possessed word-bearers stood guard at each circle, their demonically enhanced senses alert for threats that might disrupt the delicate warp working in progress. Their presence also served to anchor warp energy in real space. The demons inhabiting their bodies existed partially in the immaterium, creating stable points around which larger manifestations could coalesce. As the killing across Nuceria intensified, the Gal Vorbak began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with any physical source. The demons within them were feeding on the death and violence, growing stronger as the ritual progressed, and their hosts' bodies struggled to contain the increasing warp energy flowing through them. Lorgar himself had taken position at the site that would serve as the ritual's epicenter, the mountain field where Angron's rebellion had ended and where the Emperor had taken him. The Word-Bearer's Primarch stood at the center of a massive ritual circle that his most senior Dark Apostles had spent days preparing. The circle's design incorporated elements from multiple Chaos traditions, blending iconography sacred to Khorne with binding patterns that would focus and direct the warp energy generated by the deaths occurring across the planet. Lorgar had brought with him artifacts of significant power, a blade that had been used in the murder of a saint, a chalice filled with blood taken from 1,000 different battlefields, and a tome bound in flayed skin that contained rituals he had learned during the pilgrimage into the Eye of Terror. These items were arranged at specific points around the circle according to patterns that Lorgar had calculated with astronomical precision. The killing continued for weeks as the World Eaters worked their way through Nuceria's population with methodical thoroughness. The 12th Legion's approach to genocide lacked any sophistication. They simply went from place to place and killed everyone they found. Cities that had stood for millennia were reduced to corpse-filled ruins. Agricultural regions became charnel fields where bodies lay so thick that the ground disappeared beneath them. Coastal areas saw populations driven into the oceans and slaughtered in the water, turning entire bays red with blood. The World Eaters did not stop to rest or regroup. The nails drove them constantly forward, and the abundance of victims meant they could kill continuously without pause. Those World Eaters who sustained injuries that would have stopped normal warriors simply continued fighting until they collapsed from blood loss or catastrophic damage to vital systems. Angron himself killed with a fury that dwarfed even his son's violence. The Primarch had dreamed of this moment for over a century, imagining the revenge he would take on the High Riders who had enslaved him. He sought out the descendants of the families who had owned him, tracking them through burning cities and dragging them from their hiding places to kill them personally. The aristocrats who had cheered as he killed in the arena died screaming as Gorechild and Gorefather reduced them to scattered meat. Angron spoke as he killed, though his words were barely comprehensible through the distortion the nails caused in his voice. He told his victims about the companions they had murdered, about the years of agony the nails had inflicted, about the Emperor's betrayal and the life that had been stolen from him. Whether the dying aristocrats understood or cared about these accusations was irrelevant. Angron killed them regardless, and their deaths joined the billions of others fueling Lorgar's ritual. The Word-Bearers monitored the ritual's progress through methods both technological and sorcerous. Augury equipment measured fluctuations in local warp realspace interface stability, tracking how the veil between dimensions was thinning as death saturated Nuceria. Sorcerers entered trance states that allowed their consciousness to perceive the immaterium directly, observing how the emotional resonance of the genocide was creating currents in the warp that flowed toward the ritual sites. Dark Apostles coordinated their efforts across the planet through Vox communication and through more esoteric means. Some had developed the ability to communicate directly through the warp, their thoughts transmitted as psychic impulses that other word-bearers sorcerers could receive and interpret. This coordination ensured that the ritual's many components remained synchronized despite being spread across an entire world. The population's terror and suffering added layers of complexity to the warp resonance that the word-bearers were cultivating. Khorne cared primarily for blood and skulls, for the simple fact of death in violence, but the manner of that death influenced how the blood god's attention was drawn. Nuceria's citizens died knowing that no rescue would come, that their world was ending, and that everything they had built across generations was being destroyed. This despair mixed with the violence of their deaths, creating warp echoes that resonated with multiple chaos powers simultaneously, even as Lorgar worked to focus the majority of the energy toward Khorne specifically. Some word-bearers sorcerers reported sensing the attention of other entities, Nurgle drawn by the despair and decay, Slaanesh attracted by the intensity of emotion, and Tzeentch interested in the complex ritual structure itself. Lorgar had prepared countermeasures against such interference, conducting additional rituals that were designed to repel the attention of gods other than Khorne, ensuring that when the moment of ascension arrived, only the blood god would be in position to claim Angron's soul. The butcher's nails were killing Angron more rapidly than even Lorgar had anticipated. The Primarch's brain was deteriorating under the implant's influence, and the constant violence on Nuceria was accelerating the damage. Angron experienced moments where his vision would simply cease, his optic nerves overwhelmed by signals from the nails. He would stumble mid-stride as his motor control failed, the implants disrupting the neural pathways that coordinated his movements. Blood ran from his nose and ears constantly, and his speech had degraded to the point where even his own sons struggled to understand him. The Red Angel was dying, his Primarch physiology finally losing its battle against the archaeotech that had been torturing him for over a century. Lorgar observed these symptoms with carefully concealed satisfaction. Angron's deteriorating condition made him more desperate, more willing to accept the transformation that Lorgar offered as his only path to continued existence. The moment of ascension approached as the death toll on Nuceria reached into the billions, and the warp around the planet became saturated with the psychic resonance of genocide. Lorgar summoned Angron to the mountain field, and the Red Angel came, his movements unsteady and his breathing labored. The Primarch of the World Eaters stood at the center of the ritual circle, while word-bearers sorcerers took up positions around its perimeter. The Gal Vorbak formed an outer ring, their possessed bodies glowing brighter as the ritual's culmination drew near. Dark apostles across Nuceria began the final phase of their workings simultaneously, their chants synchronized through methods that transcended normal communication. The words they spoke were not High Gothic or any human language, but rather syllables that existed primarily as warp phenomena, sounds that caused reality itself to shudder as they were pronounced. Lorgar raised his arms and began the central invocation, calling upon Khorne to witness the offering that had been prepared in the blood god's name. He spoke of the billions who had died on Nuceria, of the violence that had saturated every meter of the planet's surface, of the warrior who stood ready to transcend mortality and become an eternal champion of slaughter. The warp responded to these words, reality thinning until observers could see through into the immaterium itself. The sky above the mountain field split open, revealing a vista of the warp that no mortal should have been able to perceive without immediately going mad. Entities moved in that impossible space, demons of Khorne drawn by the promise of a Primarch's soul, greater and more terrible than any demon that had yet manifested during the heresy. Angron screamed as the transformation began, though whether in agony or ecstasy was impossible to determine. His body convulsed, muscles spasming as warp energy flooded through his physical form. The butcher's nails, which had tortured him for so long, suddenly activated with intensity that exceeded anything he had experienced before. Every pain receptor in his body fired simultaneously, creating suffering so absolute that it transcended physical sensation and became something that existed primarily in the warp. This agony served as the final component of the ritual, the breaking of Angron's last connection to his mortal existence, the severing of whatever remained of the person he had been before the nails. The Primarch's screams echoed across Nuceria and into the warp itself, and Khorne heard and claimed what was offered. The transformation itself defied physical laws as Angron's body was simultaneously destroyed and remade. His flesh burned away, consumed by warp fire that reduced him to a skeleton that itself began to change. Bones lengthened and thickened, growing far beyond even a Primarch's considerable size. New structures emerged, wings that had never existed in his mortal form, horns that sprouted from a skull that was reshaping itself into something that blended human and demonic characteristics. Muscle and skin reformed over this new skeleton, but the tissue bore no resemblance to human anatomy. Angron's new body was red, the color of arterial blood, and it radiated heat that caused the air around him to shimmer. His face had become a mask of pure rage. All traces of the person he had been erased in favor of an expression of eternal fury. The newly ascended demon prince stood at a height that dwarfed even his previous Primarch stature, easily 4 times the size of a normal Astartes. His wings spread wide, their span sufficient to cast shadows over the entire ritual site. The chain axes Gorchuld and Gorefather had transformed along with their wielder, growing in size and gaining properties that marked them as demon weapons. The axes burned with warp fire, and their teeth moved with a life of their own, eager to tear into flesh. Angron's eyes had become pits of flame that saw into both the materium and immaterium simultaneously, perceiving reality in ways that his mortal consciousness could never have comprehended. He was no longer truly Angron. That person had died in the transformation. What remained was a demon prince wearing the memories and rage of the gladiator who had once been a Primarch, bound eternally to Khorne's service. The immediate aftermath of the ascension demonstrated the scale of power that a demon prince commanded. Angron's first action in his new form was to roar, and that sound carried force that transcended mere volume. The psychic component of the roar killed thousands of World Eaters and Word-bearers who were too close to the ritual site, their minds simply unable to process the warp-saturated sound. Those who survived found themselves driven to their knees, even Astartes' physiology insufficient to withstand the pressure of a demon prince's presence. The mountain itself began to crack, fissures spreading from the ritual circle as reality struggled to contain the entity that had just been born into it. Angron spread his wings and took flight, rising above Nuceria's surface to survey what remained of his homeworld. The planet had been transformed into a monument to slaughter, every city reduced to ruins, and every population center emptied of life. The World Eaters had accomplished in weeks what would have taken conventional military forces years, the complete extermination of a world's population. From his vantage point above the carnage, the demon prince could perceive the warp resonance that saturated Nuceria, the psychic scars that billions of violent deaths had carved into reality itself. These scars would persist for centuries, making Nuceria a place where the barrier between real space and the warp remained permanently weakened, where demons could manifest with ease, and where any human who remained would be driven mad by the psychic echoes of genocide. The transformation had cost Angron more than Lorgar had revealed during his manipulation of the Red Angel toward this fate. As a demon prince, Angron was now bound to the warp in ways that limited his ability to exist in real space. He could not maintain physical manifestation indefinitely without enormous expenditures of warp energy, and he required specific conditions to appear in the materium at all. The Primarch who had once led his legion across the galaxy was now a creature who could only emerge during the most violent battles, when blood flowed freely enough to sustain his presence. Khorne owned him absolutely. The blood god could summon him or dismiss him at will, and Angron's consciousness had been reshaped to desire only slaughter and the collection of skulls for his patron's throne. Whatever capacity for thought or feeling beyond rage that had survived the nails was now completely gone, replaced by demonic instincts that recognized only violence. The World Eaters who witnessed their Primarch's transformation reacted with a mixture of awe and increased aggression. Those with enough cognitive function remaining to understand what had occurred saw Angron's ascension as validation of their own path. If their Gene Father had transcended mortality through service to Khorne, then perhaps they too might achieve such elevation. The majority simply recognized that Angron had become more than he was, that he radiated power that called to the nails implanted in their own skulls, and they killed with renewed enthusiasm in response to his presence. The 12th Legion had followed a broken Primarch who was slowly dying. Now they followed a demon prince of the Blood God, and this transformation would reshape the World Eaters' culture and identity for the millennia to come. Lorgar observed his brother's ascension with satisfaction that he concealed behind expressions of reverence and celebration. The Word-Bearer's Primarch had accomplished what he had set out to achieve. Angron had been elevated to demonhood, providing the final surge of warp energy necessary to stabilize the Ruinstorm permanently. The ritual's success also demonstrated Lorgar's mastery of chaos worship and his understanding of how to manipulate both his brothers and the ruinous powers themselves. He had transformed Angron from a liability into a weapon, had bound one of the Emperor's sons to the service of the Dark Gods, and had proven that even Primarchs could be corrupted and remade according to Chaos's design. The Urizen had taken another step toward his ultimate goal of bringing the Imperium into the worship of the true gods, and Nuceria stood as a monument to what faith in the ruinous powers could accomplish. The Word-Bearer's orbital assault had transformed Calth's surface into an irradiated wasteland within hours of the initial betrayal, but the true war began when the Ultramarines retreated into the planet's vast subterranean network. Calth's arcologies had been constructed over centuries to shelter populations during the periodic solar flares that Viridian, the system's star, produced as part of its natural cycle. These underground cities stretched for hundreds of kilometers beneath the planet's crust, interconnected by transit tunnels and service corridors that created a three-dimensional maze of habitable spaces, industrial facilities, and life support infrastructure. The arcologies had been designed to sustain millions of civilians and provide manufacturing capacity even when the surface became temporarily uninhabitable. No one had anticipated they would become the setting for a grinding war of attrition that would consume both legions for years beyond the initial treachery. Corferon's forces controlled the surface and the orbital space above Calth, but the first captain of the Word-Bearers discovered that translating this advantage into victory underground required a completely different approach to warfare. The arcologies denied the 17th Legion many of their most effective tools. Orbital bombardment could not reach targets buried kilometers beneath rock and reinforced ferrocrete. The vast spaces that allowed for maneuver warfare on planetary surfaces gave way to corridors where even a single squad could establish killing zones that would cost dozens of lives to clear. The Word-Bearers had planned for a swift, devastating strike that would eliminate the Ultramarines as a fighting force within days. Instead, they found themselves committed to a protracted underground campaign against an enemy that refused to accept defeat. Captain Remus Ventanus emerged as one of the most significant Ultramarines commanders during the early stages of the Underworld War, demonstrating the 13th Legion's capacity for adaptation even in the face of catastrophic losses. Ventanus had survived the initial betrayal through a combination of tactical acumen and fortune, rallying scattered Ultramarines units in the arcology sections around Landshire. The captain recognized immediately that conventional defensive strategies would fail against an enemy that held orbital supremacy and could reinforce their ground forces at will. Instead, he organized the Ultramarine survivors into smaller, more mobile units that could strike Word-Bearers' positions and withdraw before the enemy could concentrate sufficient force to overwhelm them. This represented a fundamental shift in Ultramarines' doctrine, which typically emphasized holding positions and executing carefully planned defensive operations rather than the hit-and-run tactics that guerrilla warfare demanded. The Ultramarines' adaptation to underground warfare required them to abandon many assumptions that had guided their tactical thinking throughout the Great Crusade. Squad-level commanders found themselves operating independently for extended periods, making decisions that would normally have required consultation with company or chapter leadership. The dense infrastructure of the arcologies meant that Vox communication was unreliable at best, with ferrocrete walls and kilometers of rock blocking signals and creating dead zones where Ultramarines units operated in complete isolation. Individual sergeants had to assess local situations and determine appropriate responses without the benefit of real-time intelligence or coordination with friendly forces in other sections. This placed enormous pressure on junior officers who had been trained to execute orders within a larger strategic framework, but now had to function as independent commanders responsible for the survival of their squads and any civilians they encountered. The civilian population trapped in Calth's arcologies complicated every aspect of the underground war. Millions of Imperial citizens had fled into the subterranean cities when the Word-Bearers' attack began, seeking shelter from the radiation storms that were stripping away the planet's atmosphere. These refugees crowded into spaces that were already operating at capacity, overwhelming life support systems, and consuming supplies that the Ultramarines would need for an extended campaign. Ventanis and other Ultramarines commanders faced impossible choices about resource allocation. Providing food and water to civilians meant their own forces would run short more quickly, but allowing civilians to starve contradicted everything the 13th Legion stood for. The Ultramarines had always seen themselves as protectors of humanity, and the presence of millions of terrified citizens depending on them for survival added a moral dimension to tactical decisions that pure military logic could not resolve. Word-Bearers' forces exploited the civilian presence with calculated cruelty. Dark Apostles identified population centers within the arcologies and deliberately drove refugees toward Ultramarines' positions, creating situations where the 13th Legion had to either accept the burden of protecting these civilians or abandon them to the enemy. When Ultramarines units did establish defensive perimeters around refugee concentrations, the Word-Bearers would target life support infrastructure in those sections, forcing the defenders to choose between maintaining their positions or evacuating civilians to areas with functioning environmental systems. Some Word-Bearers commanders conducted massacres in arcology sections they controlled, ensuring that survivors would spread word of the atrocities and create panic that disrupted Ultramarines' operations in adjacent areas. The presence of demons in Calth's depths transformed sections of the arcology network into zones where reality itself became unreliable. Word-Bearers' sorcerers conducted rituals throughout the underground cities, using the deaths of civilians and the psychic resonance of the ongoing battle to thin the barrier between real space and the warp. These rituals created localized warp breaches that allowed demonic entities to manifest in the material universe without the extensive preparations that summoning normally required. The demons that appeared in Calth's arcologies ranged from lesser entities like bloodletters and plaguebearers to more powerful creatures whose presence caused physical laws to break down in their immediate vicinity. Temperature would fluctuate wildly in demon-haunted sections, with some corridors becoming furnace hot, while others froze to temperatures that should have been impossible given the arcology's climate control systems. Ultramarines who encountered these warp-corrupted zones reported phenomena that defied rational explanation. Corridors would extend far beyond their actual physical dimensions, with squads walking for hours through passages that maps indicated should have been only a few hundred meters long. Gravity became inconsistent, with some areas experiencing fluctuations that sent equipment and personnel floating, or crushing them against floors with force that exceeded standard planetary gravity by orders of magnitude. Time itself seemed to flow differently in the most heavily corrupted sections. Ultramarines who entered these zones might experience hours or days of subjective time, while only minutes passed outside, or vice versa. Some squads that entered demon-haunted areas were never heard from again, their final Vox transmissions describing things that should not have been possible before communication cut off entirely. The Ultramarines' doctrinal emphasis on logic and adherence to the imperial truth left them poorly prepared to combat warp-based threats. The 13th Legion had been raised to believe that the universe operated according to comprehensible physical laws, that every phenomenon had a rational explanation, and that superstition and religious faith represented primitive thinking that the Imperium had transcended. Demons violated all these assumptions. They were entities that existed primarily in a dimension where thought and emotion had physical force, where cause and effect operated according to rules that had nothing to do with material physics, and where the act of belief itself could alter reality. Ultramarines who encountered demons for the first time often experienced a form of cognitive dissonance that temporarily impaired their combat effectiveness. Their training insisted that what they were seeing could not exist, while their senses provided undeniable evidence that it did. Individual squads developed ad hoc countermeasures through bitter experience and desperate experimentation. Some Ultramarines discovered that certain weapons proved more effective against demonic entities than others. Flamers that normally served as area denial tools could disrupt demon manifestations, while plasma weapons seemed to cause warp entities more difficulty in maintaining physical form than conventional bolt rounds. Librarians, who had been viewed with suspicion by some elements of the 13th Legion due to their psychic abilities, became invaluable assets in demon-haunted sections. These psychers could perceive warp phenomena directly and provide warning when demonic manifestations were imminent, giving their squads precious seconds to prepare or withdraw. The librarians also discovered they could use their own abilities to counter some warp effects, creating psychic barriers that offered limited protection against demonic powers or disrupting the rituals that word-bearers' sorcerers conducted to maintain breaches in reality. The underground war settled into patterns of violence that repeated across different sections of the arcology network with grim consistency. Word-bearers' forces would advance through the tunnels, securing junction points and establishing forward positions from which they could project force deeper into Ultramarines-held territory. The 17th Legion maintained their organizational discipline even in the confined spaces, with tactical squads clearing corridors, while heavy weapons teams established firing positions to cover their advance. Dark Apostles accompanied these operations, conducting rituals at captured locations to establish zones of warp corruption that would make it easier for demons to manifest and harder for the Ultramarines to reclaim the territory. Ultramarines' counterattacks focused on disrupting word-bearers, supply lines, and eliminating isolated enemy units before they could be reinforced. Ventanis and other commanders identified patterns in how the word-bearers operated underground. The 17th Legion required regular resupply from the surface. Their forces needed to maintain Vox communication with command elements to coordinate their advances, and their sorcerers required specific conditions to conduct their most powerful rituals. Ultramarine strike forces targeted these vulnerabilities, ambushing supply convoys in transit tunnels, destroying Vox relay stations to create communication blackouts, and interrupting rituals before they could be completed. These operations required precise timing and flawless execution, because any Ultramarines unit that became pinned down in word-bearers controlled territory faced overwhelming enemy reinforcements that would arrive within minutes. The perpetual darkness of the arcologies created psychological pressures that affected even Astartes. The underground cities had been designed with artificial lighting that simulated day-night cycles, but the word-bearers' initial assault had damaged power generation systems throughout the network. Large sections of the arcologies operated on emergency lighting that provided only minimal illumination, creating an environment of shadows and uncertain visibility that made every corridor a potential ambush site. Ultramarines who had fought across dozens of worlds under open skies found themselves operating in spaces where they could see no more than a few dozen meters in any direction, where threats could emerge from ventilation ducts or maintenance tunnels that honeycombed the arcology walls, and where the absence of any reference to the outside world created a sense of isolation that gnawed at morale. The radiation storms raging on Calth's surface ensured that the underground war would continue indefinitely, because neither side could safely evacuate or bring in substantial reinforcements. Corferon's sabotage of the orbital platforms that regulated Viridian's radiation output had created conditions on the surface that would persist for years or potentially decades. Any ship attempting to land or launch from Calth would have to navigate through radiation levels that could kill unprotected humans within minutes and damage even shielded spacecraft with extended exposure. The word-bearers maintained control of the few hardened landing sites that could still operate under these conditions, but the radiation limited how many troops and how much materiel they could bring down from orbit. The Ultramarines had no access to the surface at all, making them completely dependent on whatever resources existed within the arcology network. Supply shortages affected both sides, but hit the Ultramarines harder due to their commitment to protecting civilians. The arcologies contained substantial stockpiles of food, water, and other necessities, but these supplies had been calculated to sustain normal population levels for limited periods during solar flares, not to support millions of refugees and thousands of Astartes engaged in active combat operations for years. Ventanis established rationing systems that prioritized combat personnel while ensuring civilians received enough to survive, but the mathematics were unforgiving. The supplies would eventually run out regardless of how carefully they were managed. Ultramarines units began conducting raids specifically to capture word-bearers' supply caches, seizing ammunition, medical supplies, and anything else that could extend their ability to continue fighting. The word-bearers faced their own logistical challenges despite their control of surface access. The radiation storms made regular resupply operations hazardous and expensive in terms of both time and resources. Cor Pharon had to balance the needs of forces fighting underground against the broader requirements of the Shadow Crusade, which was simultaneously prosecuting operations across dozens of other worlds. The first captain could not commit unlimited resources to Calth without weakening word-bearers' operations elsewhere, but he also could not afford to allow the Ultramarines to survive and potentially break out of the arcologies. This created a situation where the word-bearers had advantages in firepower and numbers, but could not leverage these advantages decisively enough to force a conclusion to the underground war. Months stretched into years as the battle for Calth's arcologies ground on without resolution. Ultramarines units that had started the war as organized companies devolved into smaller bands of survivors who knew every meter of their operational areas, but had lost contact with any higher command structure. Some sections of the arcology network changed hands dozens of times as Ultramarines and word-bearers' forces fought over the same corridors and junction points in battles that became ritualized through repetition. Individual Ultramarines who survived long enough developed a kind of feral expertise in underground warfare, learning to navigate by sound and air currents when lighting failed, to identify word-bearers' positions by the subtle changes in temperature that their rituals created, and to function effectively despite injuries that would have required medical attention under normal circumstances. The hatred that developed between the survivors on both sides exceeded anything that normal military rivalry could produce. Ultramarines who watched their brothers die to treachery, who witnessed demons dragging screaming civilians into the warp, and who fought for years in darkness without hope of relief, developed a focused rage toward the word-bearers that would persist for millennia. This was not the clean anger of warriors facing honorable enemies, but something darker, a bitter fury born from betrayal and sustained by years of grinding attrition warfare. Veterans of Calth's underworld war would carry this hatred for the rest of their lives, and it would be passed down through the Ultramarines' teaching and culture to generations who had not witnessed the betrayal firsthand. The word-bearers became more than enemies. They became the embodiment of everything the Ultramarines opposed, traitors whose existence represented a wound in the natural order that could only be healed through their complete destruction. Roboute Guilliman's escape from Calth came at tremendous cost, both in lives and in the strategic position of Ultramar. The Primarch had been fighting in the deepest sections of the arcologies when word reached him that some Ultramarines' fleet elements had managed to break free from the orbital ambush. The decision to abandon Calth, while millions of his sons remained trapped underground fighting word-bearers, forces represented the kind of impossible choice that the heresy forced upon all the loyal Primarchs. Guilliman understood that remaining on Calth meant potentially losing the entire war for Ultramar. Cor Pharon's betrayal had been the opening move in a larger campaign, and intelligence reports filtering in from other worlds indicated that word-bearers and World Eaters forces were striking across multiple systems simultaneously. The Lord of Ultramar could either stay and fight alongside his trapped sons, or leave them to their fate and attempt to coordinate a defense of his realm. He chose the latter, though the decision would haunt him for the rest of his existence. The Primarch's extraction from Calth involved a desperate fighting withdrawal through arcology sections that the word-bearers had not yet fully secured. Guilliman led a force of several thousand Ultramarines toward one of the few surface access points that remained nominally under Loyalist control, fighting through word-bearers' positions that had been established to prevent exactly this kind of breakout attempt. The running battle through kilometers of corridors and transit tunnels demonstrated why the Ultramarines had survived the initial betrayal. Their capacity for coordinated tactical maneuvers remained intact even under the most adverse conditions. Squads provided covering fire while others advanced. Heavy weapons teams established temporary defensive positions that held just long enough for the main force to pass through, and the entire operation proceeded with a precision that spoke to decades of training and the leadership of a Primarch who had literally written the manual on combined arms warfare. The surface of Calth had become a nightmare landscape of radiation and toxic atmospheric remnants by the time Guilliman's force emerged from the arcologies. Viridian's corrupted output had stripped away much of the planet's atmosphere, and what remained was laced with particles that would kill unaugmented humans within minutes. Even Astartes' armor's environmental seals were tested by the conditions, and several Ultramarines died when their suits sustained damage during the ascent that allowed the poisoned air to reach their respiratory systems. The Primarch himself led from the front, his presence serving as a rallying point for warriors who had been fighting in darkness for weeks and who now faced a surface that bore no resemblance to the thriving world they had known. Thunderhawks and other atmospheric craft descended through the radiation storms to extract the survivors, their pilots navigating by instruments alone, because visibility had been reduced to nearly zero by the particle-laden air. Guilliman reached orbit to find what remained of his fleet in a state that barely qualified as combat-ready. The word-bearer's initial strike had destroyed or crippled dozens of Ultramarines' vessels, and those ships that had survived bore damage that would normally have required months in orbital shipyards to repair. The Primarch immediately began issuing orders that demonstrated his capacity for strategic triage. Vessels that could still fight were organized into battle groups. Those too damaged for combat, but still capable of warp travel, were tasked with evacuating what personnel could be saved from Calth, and ships that could neither fight nor flee were stripped of anything useful before being abandoned. The Lord of Ultramar understood that Calth was lost for the foreseeable future, that tens of thousands of his sons would remain trapped in the arcologies fighting a war they could not win, and that his immediate priority had to be preventing the Shadow Crusade from achieving its broader objectives. The intelligence picture that Guilliman assembled during the voyage away from Calth revealed the true scope of the threat facing Ultramar. Astropathic communications were becoming increasingly unreliable due to warp disturbances that seemed to be intensifying with each passing day, but enough fragmentary reports reached the Primarch to confirm that word-bearers and World Eaters forces were conducting simultaneous operations across dozens of worlds. The pattern suggested careful coordination. The traitors were not simply raiding, but rather executing a systematic campaign designed to destroy Ultramar's infrastructure and military capacity. Guilliman recognized Lorgar's hand in this strategy, the methodical approach that characterized the word-bearers' operations even after their fall to chaos. The Lord of Ultramar began formulating a response that would leverage the Ultramarines' remaining strengths while acknowledging the brutal reality that he could not defend every world in his realm simultaneously. The consolidation of scattered Ultramarines' forces became Guilliman's first operational priority. The betrayal at Calth had caught significant elements of the 13th Legion concentrated in one location, but substantial forces remained dispersed across Ultramar and beyond. Chapter Masters commanding these scattered elements had been operating independently since communications became unreliable, making decisions based on incomplete intelligence about the broader strategic situation. Guilliman dispatched fast courier ships to every known Ultramarines position with orders to concentrate forces at specific rally points. These orders reflected the Primarch's understanding that the Ultramarines could not win a war of attrition spread across hundreds of worlds. They needed to mass their strength and engage the traitors in battles where superior Ultramarines' coordination and discipline could overcome the enemy's advantages in surprise and demonic support. Armatura emerged as the logical focal point for Guilliman's counterstrike due to its strategic importance and symbolic value. The world served as a major recruitment center for the Ultramarines, maintaining facilities that identified potential aspirants from across multiple sectors and put them through preliminary trials before sending the most promising candidates to Macragge for final selection and transformation. Beyond its role in Legion recruitment, Armatura functioned as a significant forge world whose manufactorums produced weapons, armor, and vehicles for Ultramar's defense forces. The planet's industrial capacity had been carefully developed over decades to support the Ultramarines' operational requirements, creating production lines that could manufacture everything from bolt rounds to land raiders according to specifications that Guilliman himself had established. Losing Armatura would cripple the 13th Legion's ability to sustain extended operations, making it a target that the traitors would inevitably assault and that Guilliman had to defend regardless of the cost. Intelligence reports confirmed that Word-Bearer's forces had already established a presence on Armatura, conducting the preliminary operations that characterized their approach to planetary assault. Dark Apostles had infiltrated the population centers and begun establishing chaos cults among segments of the population that were vulnerable to their promises and threats. These cults had sabotaged some defense infrastructure and provided intelligence about Ultramarines' positions to the Word-Bearer's commanders coordinating the assault. The corruption had not progressed as far on Armatura as it had on some other worlds that the Shadow Crusade had struck, largely because the planet's population maintained strong cultural ties to the Ultramarines and proved more resistant to the Word-Bearer's ideological subversion. Nevertheless, the presence of traitor forces on Armatura meant that Guilliman would be arriving to reinforce a defense already in progress, rather than establishing positions before the enemy attacked. The Primarch assembled a relief force that represented a substantial portion of the Ultramarines' remaining combat power. Multiple chapters that had been operating independently received orders to converge on Armatura, bringing with them whatever fleet assets and ground forces they could muster. Guilliman also secured support from Mechanicum forces that maintained facilities on Armatura and surrounding worlds, calling in debts and leveraging relationships that stretched back decades. The Mechanicum contribution included Titan legions, Skitarii cohorts, and technical specialists who could maintain the advanced equipment that both sides would deploy during the coming battle. The force that Guilliman led toward Armatura numbered in the tens of thousands of Astartes supported by hundreds of thousands of auxiliary troops and war machines, a concentration of military power that under normal circumstances would have been sufficient to conquer entire sectors. The warp journey to Armatura proceeded through an immaterium that had become noticeably more turbulent since the Shadow Crusade began. Navigators reported difficulties maintaining stable routes, describing currents in the warp that seemed to be flowing in patterns that defied their understanding of how the immaterium normally behaved. Some ships in Guilliman's fleet experienced temporal distortions during transit, arriving at Armatura hours or even days before or after they should have based on their departure times and the routes they had followed. The Primarch recognized these phenomena as evidence of large-scale warp manipulation, the kind of sorcerous working that required coordinated rituals across multiple worlds and the sacrifice of millions of lives. He understood that Lorgar was attempting something far more ambitious than simply conquering Ultramar. The Word-Bearers sought to fundamentally alter the relationship between realspace and the warp in this entire region of the galaxy. Armatura's orbital space was already contested when Guilliman's fleet emerged from the warp. Word-Bearers' vessels had established positions that allowed them to interdict supply routes and bombard selected surface targets, though they had not achieved the kind of overwhelming supremacy that Corferon had managed at Calth. The presence of Mechanicum defense platforms and the remnants of the Ultramarines fleet elements that had been stationed at Armatura before the attack meant that the traitors had to fight for every advantage rather than simply dictating the terms of engagement. Guilliman's arrival shifted the balance decisively in the Loyalists' favor, his reinforcements providing enough additional firepower to drive the Word-Bearers' fleet back from low orbit and establish secure approach corridors for landing operations. The Primarch's assessment of the ground situation revealed that Armatura's defenders had managed to contain the initial Word-Bearers' assault, but were under increasing pressure as traitor reinforcements continued to arrive. The planet's surface had become a patchwork of contested zones, with Ultramarines and Mechanicum forces holding the major population centers and industrial facilities, while Word-Bearers' units controlled significant portions of the surrounding territory. Dark Apostles had established ritual sites at multiple locations, conducting ceremonies that summoned demonic entities to support their ground operations. The presence of these warp-spawned creatures complicated the tactical picture because they required different countermeasures than conventional enemy forces, and their ability to appear suddenly in areas that should have been secure meant that the Ultramarines could not rely on traditional defensive perimeters. Guilliman's tactical approach to the Armatura campaign reflected his understanding that this battle would determine not just the fate of one world, but the trajectory of the entire war for Ultramar. He could not afford a defensive posture that would allow the Word-Bearers to grind down his forces through attrition. Instead, the Primarch planned an aggressive counteroffensive that would seize the initiative and force the traitors to respond to Ultramarines' actions rather than executing their own operational plan. The strategy involved simultaneous strikes against Word-Bearers' positions across multiple theaters, concentrating Ultramarines' forces at critical points to achieve local superiority, while preventing the enemy from massing their own strength effectively. This approach played to the 13th Legion's strengths in coordination and combined arms warfare, while minimizing the advantages that the Word-Bearers gained from their demonic support and willingness to accept unlimited casualties. The deployment of Ultramarines' forces proceeded with the methodical precision that characterized all of Guilliman's military operations. Tactical companies landed at designated zones and immediately began establishing secure perimeters, their movements coordinated through a communications network that the Primarch staff had spent the voyage to Armatura planning in exhaustive detail. Heavy armor rolled off landing ships and moved to support infantry advances, land raiders providing mobile fire support, while predators engaged enemy armor at ranges that exploited their superior targeting systems. Mechanicum forces integrated seamlessly into this deployment, Skitarii cohorts taking up positions that allowed their specialized weapons to provide overlapping fields of fire, while Titan legions advanced toward objectives that required their overwhelming firepower to secure. The Word-Bearers responded to Guilliman's arrival with their own reinforcements, and intelligence reports confirmed what the Primarch had feared. The World Eaters were also converging on Armatura. The 12th Legion's presence transformed the nature of the coming battle, because their approach to warfare bore no resemblance to conventional military operations. The World Eaters would not maneuver for advantage or attempt to seize strategic objectives through careful planning. They would simply charge toward the nearest enemy and kill until nothing remained alive or until they themselves were destroyed. This predictability made them easier to counter in theory, but the sheer ferocity of World Eaters' assaults meant that defensive positions designed to stop normal attacks would simply be overwhelmed by warriors who experienced wounds as minor inconveniences, and who would continue fighting until catastrophic damage to their bodies made further movement impossible. The three-way nature of the battle created tactical complexities that tested even Guilliman's strategic acumen. The Ultramarines faced two distinct enemy forces whose approaches to warfare differed so fundamentally that countering one often created vulnerabilities to the other. Defensive positions strong enough to withstand World Eaters' charges required concentrations of firepower that left flanks exposed to Word-Bearers' infiltration and sorcerous attacks. Mobile operations that could respond to Word-Bearers' movements lacked the density necessary to stop World Eaters' berserker assaults. The Primarch adapted his strategy continuously, as the battle developed, shifting forces between theaters based on real-time intelligence about enemy movements, and accepting that some positions would have to be abandoned to maintain the overall integrity of the Ultramarines' defensive network. The arrival of both traitor Primarchs on Armatura's surface escalated the conflict to a level that transcended normal planetary warfare. Lorgar materialized at the center of a ritual circle that his dark apostles had prepared, the word-bearer's Primarch's presence immediately strengthening the warp manifestations that plagued Ultramarines' positions. Angron descended from orbit in a drop-pod assault that killed dozens of his own World Eaters through the psychic pressure of his demonic presence, the newly ascended Demon Prince eager to test his transformed capabilities against worthy opponents. The two traitor Primarchs represented fundamentally different threats. Lorgar commanded strategic operations and enhanced his legion's sorceress capabilities through his own mastery of warp manipulation, while Angron simply killed everything in his path with a fury that mortal warriors could not match. Guilliman recognized that his brother's presence on Armatura created both danger and opportunity. The traitor Primarchs were the linchpins of the Shadow Crusade's command structure, and their commitment to this battle meant they could not be directing operations on other worlds simultaneously. If Guilliman could defeat or drive off Lorgar and Angron here, it would disrupt the entire campaign and potentially buy time for Ultramar's defenders to consolidate their positions across multiple systems. The Lord of Ultramar began positioning his own forces for a confrontation that he knew was inevitable. The three Primarchs would meet in battle, and the outcome would determine Armatura's fate and possibly the future of Ultramar itself. The fighting intensified as Word-Bearers and World Eaters forces pushed toward the primary industrial complexes that represented Armatura's strategic value. Guilliman established his command position at the largest manufactorum facility, a sprawling complex that produced the majority of the planet's military equipment, and that could not be allowed to fall into traitor hands. Ultramarines companies fortified the approaches to this facility, establishing kill zones that would force the World Eaters to advance through concentrated fire while maintaining mobile reserves that could respond to Word-Bearers' infiltration attempts. Mechanicum forces deployed their heaviest assets to support this defense, including Warlord Titans, whose void shields and massive weapons provided firepower that even demonic entities struggled to overcome. The World Eaters struck first, their assault beginning with a drop-pod bombardment that deposited hundreds of berserkers directly into the outer defensive perimeters. The 12th Legion warriors emerged from their pods already killing, chain axes tearing through Ultramarines' defenders before organized resistance could form. The initial momentum of this assault carried the World Eaters deep into the defensive network, their complete disregard for casualties allowing them to overrun positions that should have held against conventional attacks. Guilliman watched this development and recognized the pattern. The World Eaters were serving as the hammer that would break his defensive lines, while Word-Bearers' forces would exploit the breaches to achieve objectives that actually mattered to the traitors' strategic goals. The Shadow Crusade's progression through Ultramar left behind a trail of devastation that transcended conventional military destruction. Each world that fell to the combined Word-Bearers and World Eaters forces became a laboratory for different forms of atrocity, with the two legions approaching the systematic brutalization of populations from their distinct philosophical positions. The Word-Bearers viewed civilian populations as raw material for rituals and corruption, carefully calculating how many deaths were needed to achieve specific warp effects and which methods of execution would generate the most useful psychic resonance. The World Eaters possessed no such sophistication in their violence. They simply killed everything they encountered with mechanical efficiency, their actions driven by the butcher's nails rather than any strategic consideration. The combination of calculated malevolence and mindless slaughter created conditions on conquered worlds that defied anything the Imperium had previously experienced during the Great Crusade. The documentation of specific atrocities committed during the Shadow Crusade comes primarily from Ultramarine survivors who later liberated affected worlds, and from scattered civilian testimonies preserved in fragmentary records. on the world of Ithraka, Word-Bearer's forces herded approximately 3 million civilians into the planet's primary hive city before sealing all exits and releasing a contagion that had been specifically engineered to cause maximum suffering before death. The disease spread through the trapped population over the course of weeks, and dark apostles stationed around the hive's perimeter conducted rituals that channeled the victims' terror and agony into warp manifestations. The sorcerers had calculated that this particular method of mass killing would create psychic resonance that aligned with Nurgle's domain, and they successfully summoned a great unclean one that manifested in the hive's center and remained anchored to real space for months afterward, its presence ensuring that Ithraka would remain corrupted long after the Shadow Crusade moved on to other targets. Van Mulder suffered a different fate when World Eaters' forces made planetfall without any Word-Bearer's oversight. The 12th Legion descended upon the world's capital city and simply began killing, moving through hab blocks and administrative buildings with chain axes swinging. The massacre continued for 72 hours without pause, World Eaters warriors killing, until the city's population of 8 million had been reduced to scattered survivors hiding in the deepest basement levels. The Berserkers did not take prisoners, did not pause to conduct rituals or establish any kind of occupation infrastructure. They existed purely to kill, and Van Mulder's capital became a charnel house where bodies lay so thick in some streets that they formed barriers several meters high. When the World Eaters finally departed, they left behind a city that was technically intact in terms of its physical structures, but completely devoid of life, except for the few thousand civilians who had managed to avoid detection during the slaughter. The systematic establishment of chaos shrines across conquered worlds represented one of the Word-Bearer's primary objectives beyond simple military conquest. Dark Apostles identified locations that possessed specific characteristics that made them suitable for permanent corruption, sites where the barrier between real space and the warp was naturally thin, places where significant historical events had occurred that left psychic impressions, or locations that held symbolic importance to the local population. At these sites, Word-Bearer's sorcerers conducted elaborate rituals that involved the torture and sacrifice of hundreds or thousands of victims, their deaths serving to anchor warp energy in the physical location. The shrines themselves were constructed using materials that resonated with chaos, stone taken from demon worlds in the Eye of Terror, metal that had been forged in warp fires, and organic components harvested from possessed individuals or demonic entities that had been temporarily bound to physical form. These shrines served multiple purposes beyond their religious significance to the Word-Bearers. They functioned as beacons that made it easier for demons to manifest in the surrounding area, effectively creating permanent weak points in reality that would persist for centuries after their construction. The shrines also corrupted anyone who spent extended time in their vicinity, gradually eroding resistance to chaos influence through constant exposure to warp radiation. Populations that remained on worlds where shrines had been established found themselves experiencing nightmares, hallucinations, and compulsions toward violence or other behaviors that served the ruinous powers. Some civilians began worshipping at the shrines without fully understanding what they were doing, drawn by psychic emanations that promised relief from suffering or power over their circumstances. The binding of demons to real space anchors represented a more sophisticated form of corruption that required extensive preparation and significant resources. Word-Bearer's sorcerers would identify individuals within conquered populations who possessed latent psychic potential or who had been broken through torture to the point where their resistance to possession had collapsed. These individuals were subjected to rituals that opened their bodies and souls to demonic entities, creating possessed humans who could serve as permanent anchors for warp manifestations. Unlike temporary possessions that required constant expenditure of warp energy to maintain, these bound individuals could exist indefinitely in real space, serving as focal points for ongoing corruption efforts. The Word-Bearers established networks of these possessed anchors across multiple worlds, creating an infrastructure of permanent warp contamination that would make it nearly impossible to fully cleanse affected regions, even if Imperial forces eventually reclaimed them. The creation of lasting warp rifts required coordination across multiple worlds and timing that aligned with specific astronomical phenomena. Dark Apostles stationed throughout the Shadow Crusade's operational area conducted synchronized rituals at moments when the barrier between dimensions was naturally weakened, during solar eclipses, at locations where ley lines of psychic energy intersected, or when particular alignments of planets created resonance effects in the warp. These rituals involved the sacrifice of massive numbers of victims, with the deaths timed to occur simultaneously across light years of space. The psychic shockwaves generated by these coordinated massacres created tears in reality that did not heal naturally, forming permanent rifts through which warp energy constantly leaked into the material universe. Some of these rifts were large enough that demons could pass through without requiring summoning rituals, effectively creating gateways between dimensions that would plague Ultramar for millennia. The civilian cost of the Shadow Crusade exceeded anything the Imperium had experienced during the Great Crusade's 2 centuries of expansion. Conservative estimates place the death toll in the hundreds of billions across the dozens of worlds that the Word-Bearers and World Eaters attacked. Entire planetary populations were exterminated, their deaths serving purposes that ranged from fueling specific rituals to simply satisfying the World Eaters' compulsion to kill. The methods of execution varied based on which legion was primarily responsible for a particular world's fate. Word-bearers' killings tended to be elaborate and ritualized, with victims dying in ways calculated to generate specific types of psychic resonance, while World Eaters' massacres were brutally efficient, populations dying to chain axe and bolt round without ceremony or purpose beyond the act of killing itself. The psychological impact on survivors who witnessed these atrocities but somehow escaped death-created trauma that would affect Ultramar's population for generations. Civilians who had believed in the Imperium's promise of protection discovered that Space Marines, beings they had been taught to revere as humanity's greatest defenders, could become monsters capable of unthinkable cruelty. The betrayal shattered fundamental assumptions about the nature of the Imperium and the reliability of its institutions. Some survivors lost their sanity entirely, their minds unable to process what they had witnessed. Others became consumed by hatred toward the traitor legions, dedicating their lives to serving the Ultramarines or other Imperial forces in hopes of eventually taking revenge. A significant portion of the survivor population developed a fatalistic worldview, concluding that the universe was fundamentally hostile and that the Imperium's promises of order and protection were lies that could be shattered at any moment. The World Eaters' descent into mindless butchery accelerated throughout the Shadow Crusade as the Butcher's nails continued their inexorable degradation of the Legion's cognitive functions. Warriors who had begun the campaign with at least some capacity for tactical thinking devolved into creatures that could barely communicate beyond roars of rage. The nails rewarded violence with the only relief from constant agony that World Eaters could experience, creating a feedback loop where the warriors sought combat not to achieve any objective, but simply to escape the pain that defined their existence between battles. This transformation was not uniform across the Legion. Some World Eaters retained more cognitive function than others, whether due to quirks in their individual physiology or variations in how their nails had been installed. These relatively lucid warriors found themselves leading squads or companies composed primarily of berserkers who could barely follow simple orders, let alone execute complex tactical maneuvers. The loss of honor and martial discipline that had once characterized the World Eaters became complete during the Shadow Crusade's later stages. The Legion had possessed its own culture and traditions before Angron's discovery, codes of conduct that governed how warriors treated each other and how they approached warfare. The spread of the nails had eroded these traditions gradually, but the Shadow Crusade's constant violence accelerated the process until virtually nothing remained of the World Eaters' former identity. Warriors who had once taken pride in their skill with blade and bolt gun became creatures that simply swung chain axes at anything that moved. The concept of honorable combat became meaningless when warriors experienced every moment not spent killing as torment. Some World Eaters began decorating their armor with trophies taken from victims, skulls, flayed skin, and other grisly mementos that served no tactical purpose, but satisfied some dim impulse towards self-expression that survived the nail's influence. The command structure within the World Eaters collapsed into a system based purely on violence and intimidation. Officers who could not physically dominate their subordinates found themselves challenged and killed, their positions taken by whoever proved most effective at killing. This created a hierarchy, where the most degraded berserkers often held the highest ranks because their complete surrender to the nails made them the most dangerous combatants. Strategic planning became impossible when commanders could barely restrain themselves from charging the enemy immediately upon contact. The World Eaters developed a reputation for attacking without reconnaissance, without coordinating with supporting elements, and without any consideration for objectives beyond killing whatever enemies were in front of them. This predictability should have made them easy to counter, but their sheer ferocity and complete disregard for casualties meant that conventional defensive tactics often failed when facing World Eaters' assaults. The relationship between individual World Eaters and their weapons changed as the nail's influence intensified. Chain axes became extensions of the warriors themselves, tools that the berserkers maintained with obsessive care even as they neglected other aspects of their equipment. Some World Eaters spent hours between battles sharpening their weapons' teeth, adjusting the chain tension, and performing maintenance rituals that represented the last vestige of the technical expertise they had once possessed as Astartes. Other weapons and equipment received minimal attention. Armor went unrepaired unless damage prevented movement. Bolters were discarded when ammunition ran out rather than being reloaded, and even basic medical care was often ignored in favor of simply continuing to fight until injuries forced a warrior to stop. This degradation of the World Eaters' material readiness would have been catastrophic for any other legion, but the 12th Legion's approach to warfare required little beyond functional close combat weapons and the ability to charge toward enemies. The word-bearers observed their allies' devolution with a mixture of contempt and utilitarian acceptance. Dark Apostles recognized that the World Eaters were becoming less useful as actual warriors and more valuable as simply vectors for violence that could be pointed at targets. The 17th Legion adapted their coordination with the World Eaters accordingly, treating the 12th Legion less like allies in a military campaign and more like a natural disaster that could be directed toward enemy positions. Word-bearer sorcerers developed rituals that could influence World Eaters' behavior to a limited degree, using warp manipulation to steer the berserkers toward specific targets or to intensify their aggression at tactically opportune moments. These manipulations worked because the nails had made the World Eaters susceptible to psychic influence in ways that normal Astartes were not. Their minds had been reduced to such simple states that even crude emotional manipulation could affect their actions. The corruption of Ultramar's infrastructure extended beyond physical destruction to include the deliberate contamination of systems that the Imperium relied upon for governance and communication. Word-bearers infiltrators identified key personnel within planetary administrations and either corrupted them through exposure to chaos or simply killed them and replaced them with cultists. These corrupted officials used their positions to spread misinformation, divert resources to traitor forces, and sabotage defensive preparations on worlds that had not yet been directly attacked. The cumulative effect of this infiltration campaign meant that even worlds that never saw word-bearers or World Eaters forces suffered degradation of their ability to resist the Shadow Crusade. Supply shipments went missing, military units received contradictory orders, and civilian populations lost faith in their leaders as the administrative apparatus that governed their lives visibly failed. The establishment of chaos cults represented a longer-term corruption strategy that would continue affecting Ultramar long after the Shadow Crusade itself ended. Word-bearers' agents moved through conquered populations, identifying individuals who were vulnerable to recruitment, those who had lost family to the fighting, who blamed the Imperium for failing to protect them, or who simply sought any explanation for the horrors they had witnessed. These initial converts were indoctrinated through a combination of psychological manipulation and exposure to warp phenomena that gradually eroded their resistance to chaos influence. The cults grew through a cell structure that made them difficult to eliminate even when Imperial authorities became aware of their existence. Each cultist would recruit a small number of additional members, who would in turn recruit others, creating networks that spread through populations like infections. The rituals that these cults conducted served multiple purposes beyond simply spreading corruption. They provided the word-bearers with intelligence about Imperial defensive preparations and troop movements. They created additional warp disturbances that made it easier for demons to manifest in affected areas. They demoralized loyalist populations by demonstrating that the corruption had spread beyond the traitor legions themselves to include ordinary humans who had chosen to serve the ruinous powers. Some cults engaged in acts of terrorism and sabotage that forced Imperial authorities to divert resources away from fighting the main traitor forces. The most successful cults managed to seize control of entire population centers, transforming them into bastions of chaos worship that would require military intervention to reclaim. The Shadow Crusade's atrocities created precedents for how chaos forces would operate during the remainder of the heresy and in the millennia that followed. The systematic approach to corruption that the word-bearers demonstrated on Ultramar's worlds would be replicated across the galaxy as other traitor forces adopted similar methodologies. The complete abandonment of any pretense of honorable warfare that characterized World Eaters' operations became the template for how Khorne-aligned forces would conduct themselves in future conflicts. The integration of demonic entities into military operations moved from theoretical possibility to established practice, with the Shadow Crusade proving that warp-born creatures could be reliably summoned and controlled sufficiently to serve tactical objectives. The transformation of entire regions of space into areas of permanent warp contamination demonstrated that chaos corruption could achieve strategic effects that persisted far beyond the immediate military campaign. The Shadow Crusade achieved its primary strategic objective with brutal efficiency. By the time the Siege of Terra began, Roboute Guilliman and the Ultramarines remained trapped in Ultramar, fighting to contain the damage inflicted by the Word-bearers and World Eaters rather than marching to the Throne World's defense. The campaign had consumed years of the heresy's timeline, forcing the 13th Legion to commit the vast majority of its strength to defending its own realm, while Horus advanced on Terra with minimal interference from the largest loyalist legion. The mathematical reality was stark. Had Guilliman been able to deploy even a fraction of his forces to Terra's defense, the siege might have ended differently. The Ultramarines possessed sufficient numbers and materiel to potentially tip the balance in favor of the defenders, but the Ruin Storm made such deployment impossible until after the crucial battles had already been decided. The strategic calculus that Lorgar had executed proved devastatingly effective. The Word-bearers Primarch understood that the Ultramarines could not be destroyed outright. The 13th Legion was too large, too well organized, and too deeply entrenched in Ultramar's infrastructure for even the combined might of two traitor legions to eliminate them completely. Instead, Lorgar had designed a campaign that would neutralize the Ultramarines as a factor in the heresy's outcome without requiring their total annihilation. The Shadow Crusade forced Guilliman to fight a defensive war across dozens of worlds simultaneously, fragmenting the Ultramarines' strength and preventing them from concentrating forces for a relief expedition to Terra. The Ruin Storm ensured that even if Guilliman had been willing to abandon Ultramar, he physically could not reach the Throne World through the warp disturbances that isolated his realm from the rest of the galaxy. The timing of Guilliman's eventual breakthrough to Terra illustrated the Shadow Crusade's success. The Ultramarines did not arrive at the Throne World until after the Emperor had been interred in the Golden Throne and Horus had been slain. The Lord of Ultramar led his forces through the dissipating Ruin Storm to find that the war he had been racing to join had already concluded in his absence. This delay fundamentally altered the heresy's outcome. Had the Ultramarines reinforced Terra during the siege itself, their presence would have provided the defenders with resources and manpower that might have prevented the Emperor's near-fatal confrontation with Horus. The strategic situation at Terra was desperate enough that even a single additional legion of loyalists could have changed the calculus of when and how Horus chose to make his final assault on the Imperial Palace. The permanent scarring of Ultramar represented damage that would require centuries to address, and in some cases could never be fully repaired. Dozens of worlds that had been thriving centers of Imperial civilization before the Shadow Crusade became demon-infested wastelands or sites of such profound warp corruption that they posed ongoing threats to surrounding systems. The Inquisition would eventually establish permanent monitoring stations around the most severely affected worlds, tracking warp phenomena and ensuring that no demonic incursions spread beyond the quarantine zones. Some planets received exterminatus declarations when it became clear that conventional cleansing operations could not eliminate the chaos taint. These worlds were destroyed from orbit, their populations sacrificed to prevent the corruption from spreading to neighboring systems. Calth survived as a functional world, but only through the complete abandonment of its surface and the transformation of its arcology network into the planet's permanent habitation zones. The radiation storms that Corferon's sabotage had unleashed continued for decades, making the surface lethal to unprotected humans and requiring massive investments in shielding technology to allow any surface operations at all. The underground cities became Calth's new reality, expanded and reinforced over centuries to accommodate populations that would never again see natural sunlight. The Ultramarines maintained significant facilities on Calth despite the planet's permanent damage, treating it as both a strategic asset and a memorial to the betrayal that had begun the Shadow Crusade. Veterans of the Underworld War trained subsequent generations of Ultramarines in the arcology's depths, ensuring that the lessons learned fighting word-bearers in darkness would be preserved and passed down. Other worlds faced different forms of permanent alteration. Armatura's industrial capacity had been so thoroughly devastated during the fighting that rebuilding to pre-heresy production levels took over a century. The manufactorums that had produced weapons and equipment for the Ultramarines were reduced to ruins that required complete reconstruction rather than simple repair. The planet's population, which had taken immense pride in its connection to the 13th Legion, suffered psychological trauma that affected multiple generations. Survivors of the Shadow Crusade struggled to reconcile their faith in the Imperium with the reality of what they had witnessed: space marines turning on each other, demons manifesting in real space, and the complete failure of Imperial institutions to protect them from forces that should not have existed according to the Imperial truth they had been taught. The worlds where word-bearers had established permanent shrines and warp rifts presented ongoing security challenges that stretched Ultramar's resources for millennia. These corrupted sites required constant monitoring and periodic military intervention to prevent demon incursions from spreading beyond containment zones. The Inquisition deployed specialized teams to study these locations, attempting to understand the mechanisms of their corruption and develop countermeasures that might allow for eventual cleansing. Some Inquisitors spent their entire careers focused on single worlds, documenting the specific nature of the warp contamination and experimenting with purification rituals that might reduce the level of demonic activity. The results were mixed at best. Some sites could be partially cleansed through sustained effort and massive expenditure of resources, while others remained permanently corrupted regardless of what measures were attempted. The rift between the Word-Bearers and World Eaters that had been developing throughout the Shadow Crusade became absolute in its aftermath. Lorgar had achieved everything he set out to accomplish. Guilliman had been delayed, the Ruinstorm had isolated Ultramar, and Angron had been elevated to demonhood. The Word-Bearers withdrew from Ultramar in relatively good order, their legion still possessing organizational cohesion and strategic direction. They had suffered casualties during the campaign, but nothing approaching the catastrophic losses that would have crippled their ability to function as a unified force. The 17th Legion departed with their fleet assets largely intact, their command structure functioning, and their Primarch satisfied that the campaign had served its intended purposes. The World Eaters faced a fundamentally different situation. Angron's transformation into a demon prince meant that he could no longer lead his legion in any conventional sense. The Red Angel existed primarily in the warp, manifesting in real space only during the most violent battles, and only for limited periods before the energy required to maintain his physical form became unsustainable. The 12th Legion found itself without consistent leadership at exactly the moment when the Nails had degraded most warriors' cognitive functions to the point where they could barely manage their own affairs, let alone coordinate Legion-wide operations. The World Eaters began fragmenting into independent warbands almost immediately, with individual captains or champions leading groups of berserkers who followed them primarily because they were the most effective killers rather than due to any formal command authority. This fragmentation served Khorne's purposes even as it destroyed the World Eaters as a unified military force. The Blood God cared nothing for organization or strategic coherence. He desired only that blood be spilled and skulls be taken. Scattered warbands of World Eaters rampaging across the galaxy served this purpose as effectively as a unified legion conducting coordinated campaigns. The warbands operated independently, attacking targets of opportunity without coordination or long-term planning. Some remained in Ultramar for years after the Shadow Crusade officially ended, continuing to raid Imperial worlds simply because the Nails drove them to seek combat, and this region of space provided abundant targets. Others dispersed across the galaxy, following their own paths of destruction wherever their increasingly damaged vessels could carry them. Lorgar observed the World Eaters' disintegration with satisfaction tempered by pragmatic assessment. The 12th Legion had served its purpose during the Shadow Crusade, providing the raw violence necessary to overwhelm defensive positions and terrorize populations. Their fragmentation into warbands did not concern the Word-Bearer's Primarch, because he had never intended to maintain a long-term alliance with Angron's sons. The World Eaters were tools that had been used and then discarded when they were no longer needed for the Word-Bearer's strategic objectives. The relationship between the two legions dissolved without any formal break or declaration. The World Eaters simply scattered to pursue their own compulsions, while the Word-Bearers moved on to other campaigns that served their theological agenda. The hatred between the Ultramarines and Word-Bearers that was forged during the Shadow Crusade transcended normal military rivalry to become something approaching religious fervor in its intensity. The 13th Legion had built its identity around principles of order, reason, and the systematic application of force to achieve strategic objectives. The Word-Bearers represented the complete inversion of these values. They embraced chaos, wielded faith as a weapon, and pursued goals that defied rational analysis. The betrayal at Calth had been personal in ways that other heresy conflicts were not, because the Word-Bearers had deliberately exploited the Ultramarines' trust and had specifically targeted Ultramar in revenge for Monarchia's destruction decades earlier. This was not simply a case of former allies finding themselves on opposite sides of a civil war. It was calculated treachery, designed to inflict maximum damage on a specific target. The Ultramarines who survived the Shadow Crusade carried their hatred for the Word-Bearers into the Scouring and beyond. Veterans of Calth's underworld war became instructors who trained subsequent generations of Ultramarines, and they ensured that every new battle brother understood the nature of the Word-Bearer's betrayal. The 13th Legion developed specialized tactics specifically for combating Word-Bearer's forces, studying their approach to warfare and identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Ultramarines librarians focused particular attention on developing countermeasures against the sorcerous abilities that Dark Apostles wielded, creating psychic techniques designed to disrupt rituals and banish summoned demons. The chapter maintained extensive intelligence networks dedicated to tracking Word-Bearers' movements across the galaxy, ensuring that any appearance of the 17th Legion would be met with immediate Ultramarines' response, if at all possible. The Word-Bearers reciprocated this hatred, with their own brand of theological contempt. To Lorgar and his sons, the Ultramarines represented everything that was wrong with the Emperor's vision for humanity: the rejection of faith, the worship of reason and order over spiritual truth, and the arrogant certainty that the material universe was all that mattered. The word-bearers viewed their conflict with the Ultramarines as fundamentally ideological rather than simply military. Every engagement with the 13th Legion became an opportunity to prove the superiority of chaos worship over the sterile rationality that Guilliman embodied. Dark Apostles conducted elaborate rituals before battles with Ultramarines forces, calling upon the ruinous powers to witness their servants' dedication and to grant the strength necessary to punish those who clung to the Emperor's lies. This blood feud persisted across 10,000 years, outliving the Primarchs who had initiated it and becoming embedded in the institutional cultures of both legions and their successor organizations. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters maintained records of every encounter with word-bearers' forces, documenting their tactics, identifying their leaders, and tracking their movements across the galaxy. When word-bearers' warbands emerged from the Eye of Terror or other warp-tainted regions to raid Imperial space, Ultramarine successors would often deploy to intercept them regardless of the strategic situation elsewhere. The opportunity to engage the word-bearers took precedence over other considerations because the grudge that originated at Calth demanded satisfaction. The word-bearers likewise prioritized operations against Ultramarines and their successors when opportunities arose. Dark Apostles would plan raids specifically targeting worlds under Ultramarines' protection, knowing that such attacks would draw out the 13th Legion's successors for battles that served both military and theological purposes. Some word-bearers' warbands spent centuries hunting specific Ultramarine successor chapters, tracking their movements and striking at their recruiting worlds or chapter monasteries in campaigns motivated by the ancient hatred rather than any immediate strategic objective. The conflict between the two forces became self-perpetuating, with each engagement adding new grievances to the accumulated list of wrongs that demanded vengeance. The broader strategic impact of the Shadow Crusade extended far beyond its immediate military objectives. The campaign demonstrated that Chaos forces could conduct coordinated operations across multiple star systems simultaneously, that demonic entities could be reliably integrated into military operations, and that entire regions of space could be corrupted to the point where they remained tainted for millennia. These lessons informed how both traitor and loyalist forces approached warfare during the remainder of the heresy and in the long war that followed. The Imperium developed new doctrines for combating chaos incursions, drawing on the bitter experience of Ultramar's defenders to create protocols for identifying corruption, containing warp breaches, and purging populations that had been exposed to demonic influence. The Inquisition's eventual formation owed much to the recognition that threats like those the Shadow Crusade had unleashed required specialized institutions to combat. The corruption that word-bearers had seeded throughout Ultramar could not be eliminated through conventional military action alone. It required investigation, intelligence gathering, and the willingness to make ruthless decisions about which populations could be saved and which had to be destroyed to prevent further contamination. The Ordo Malleus would specifically focus on demonic threats, developing expertise in the summoning methods that Dark Apostles employed in creating countermeasures based on understanding gained from studying sites where the word-bearers had established permanent warp rifts. The fragmentation of the World Eaters established patterns that would characterize Khorne-aligned forces for the remainder of Imperial history. The warband structure that emerged from the 12th Legion's collapse became the standard organizational model for Chaos forces dedicated to the Blood God. These warbands operated independently, following champion leaders who maintained their positions through constant demonstrations of martial prowess rather than any formal command authority. The lack of strategic coordination that this structure created was offset by the sheer unpredictability it generated. Imperial forces could never anticipate where World Eaters' warbands might strike, because the warbands themselves often did not know, until they detected targets that the nails drove them to attack. The transformation of Angron into a demon prince created the template for how other Chaos champions would seek similar elevation. The ritual that Lorgar conducted on Nuceria demonstrated that even Primarchs could be corrupted and remade according to the ruinous power's designs, proving that ascension to demonhood was achievable for those willing to pay its price. Other traitor Primarchs would eventually follow similar paths, each transformation requiring specific conditions and enormous sacrifices, but ultimately granting immortality and power that transcended even their original capabilities. The existence of demon Primarchs fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Long War because these entities could not be permanently killed through conventional means. They could be banished back to the warp, but they would eventually return when conditions allowed their manifestation. The Shadow Crusade's conclusion left Ultramar permanently changed in ways that affected its character throughout the following millennia. The realm that Guilliman had built as a model of imperial governance and military efficiency had been revealed as vulnerable to the same forces that threatened the rest of the Imperium. The populations of Ultramar lost the sense of security that had characterized their existence before the heresy, understanding that even the most organized and defended regions of imperial space could be devastated by enemies that wielded powers beyond normal comprehension. This loss of innocence created a population that was more militarized, more suspicious of outsiders, and more willing to accept harsh measures in the name of security than had been the case before the Word-Bearer's betrayal. The Ultramarines themselves emerged from the Shadow Crusade as a legion that had been tested in ways that few others experienced during the heresy. They had fought a grinding defensive war across their own territory, witnessed the corruption of worlds they had sworn to protect, and faced enemies that violated every principle of warfare they had been taught. The experience forced doctrinal evolution that made the 13th Legion more flexible in its thinking and more willing to adapt to threats that defied conventional military logic. The Codex Astartes that Guilliman would eventually write incorporated lessons learned during the Shadow Crusade, including protocols for combating demonic entities, procedures for identifying and containing chaos corruption, and organizational structures designed to prevent the kind of catastrophic losses that concentration of forces in a single location had enabled at Calth. The Shadow Crusade stood as one of the heresy's most successful traitor operations when measured against its strategic objectives. Lorgar had set out to delay Guilliman's arrival at Terra, corrupt Ultramar, and elevate Angron to demonhood. He achieved all three goals while maintaining the Word-Bearers as an effective fighting force. The campaign demonstrated the Word-Bearers' capacity for strategic planning, and their mastery of chaos worships practical applications in warfare. The 17th Legion emerged from Ultramar, with their reputation enhanced among other traitor forces, having proven that faith in the ruinous powers could achieve objectives that conventional military operations could not. The cost of this success, measured in lives destroyed and worlds corrupted, exceeded anything the Imperium had previously experienced. The Shadow Crusade killed hundreds of billions of Imperial citizens, corrupted dozens of worlds beyond any hope of redemption, and created warp phenomena that would persist for 10,000 years. The campaign established precedents for how chaos forces would operate in the millennia following the heresy, demonstrating methodologies that would be replicated across the galaxy as the Long War continued. The hatred between the Ultramarines and Word-Bearers that originated during this campaign would fuel conflicts across 10 millennia, with both sides seeking opportunities to inflict damage on ancient enemies in battles that served as much to satisfy old grudges as to achieve any immediate strategic objective. The Shadow Crusade's legacy endured long after its immediate military objectives had been achieved, shaping the character of both the Ultramarines and Word-Bearers as they evolved into the forces they would become in the 41st millennium. The betrayal at Calth remained a defining moment in Ultramarines' history, taught to every new battle brother as an example of treachery's cost and the importance of eternal vigilance against chaos corruption. The Word-Bearers preserved their own understanding of the campaign, viewing it as a triumph of faith over reason and a demonstration of what dedicated servants of the ruinous powers could accomplish when they committed themselves fully to their god's service. The blood spilled across Ultramar's worlds during those years of horror would never be forgotten by either side, and the desire for vengeance would drive both legions to seek each other across the galaxy for as long as the Imperium and Chaos continued their eternal war.